Chapter 9. "If you're not careful," said Angelica, glowering under the bulge of her forehead, "I shall sing the first spell that comes into my head, and I hope it turns you into a slug." That was a threat indeed. Tonino quailed a little, but the honor of the Montanas was at stake. "Take back what you said about my family," he said. "Only if you take back what you said about mine," said Angelica. "Swear by the angel of Caprona that none of those dreadful lies are true. Look, I've got the angel here. Come and swear." Her pink finger jabbed down at the tabletop. She reminded Tonino of his schoolteacher on a bad day. He left his creaking chair and leaned over to see what she was pointing at. Angelica fussily dusted away a shower of yellow varnish to show him that she indeed had the angel, scratched with the useless tap into the top of the table. It was quite a good drawing, considering that the tap was not a good gouge and had shown a tendency to slip about. But Tonino was not prepared to admire it. "You've forgotten the scroll," he said. Angelica jumped up, and her flimsy chair crashed over backwards. "That does it! You've asked for it!" She marched over to the empty space by the windows and took up a position of power. From there, with her hands raised, she looked at Tonino to see if he was going to relent. Tonino would have liked to relent. He did not want to be a slug. He sought about in his mind for some way of giving in which did not look like simple cowardice. But, as with everything, he was too slow. Angelica flounced around so that her arms were no longer at quite the right angle. "Right," she said. "I shall make it a cancel spell, to cancel you out." And she began to sing. Angelica's voice was horrible, sharp and flat by turns and wandering from key to key. Tonino would have liked to interrupt her, or at least distract her by making noises, but he did not quite dare. That might only make things worse. He waited while Angelica squawked out a couple of verses of a spell which seemed to center around the words, "Turn the spell around, break the spell off." Since he was a boy and not a spell, Tonino rather hoped it would not do anything to him. Angelica raised her arms higher for the third verse and changed key for the sixth time. "Turn the spell off, break the spell around." "That's wrong," said Tonino. "Don't you dare put me off," snapped Angelica, and turned around to say it, which sent the angle of her arms more thoroughly wrong than ever. One hand was now pointing at a window. "I command the unbinding of that which was bound," she sang, cross and shrill. Tonino looked quickly down at himself, but he seemed to be still there, and the usual colour. He told himself that he had known all along that such a bungled spell could not possibly work. There came a great creaking from the ceiling just above the windows. The whole room swayed. Then, to Tonino's amazement, the entire front wall of the room, windows and all, split away from the side walls and the ceiling and fell outwards with a soft clatter. A curiously soft sound for the whole side of a house. A draught of musty-smelling air blew in through the open space. Angelica was quite as astonished as Tonino, but that did not prevent her turning to him with a smug and triumphant smile. "See, my spells always work." "Let's get out," said Tonino. "Quick, before somebody comes." They ran out across the painted panels between the windows, across the marks Tonino had made with the chair. They stepped down off the surprisingly clean, straight edge where the wall had joined the ceiling, onto the terrace in front of the house. It appeared to be made of wood, not of stone, as Tonino had expected, and beyond that... They stopped just in time at the edge of a huge cliff. Both of them swayed forward and caught at one another. The cliff went down sheer into murky darkness. They could not see the bottom, nor could they see much more when they looked straight ahead. There was a blaze of red-gold sunlight there, dazzling them. "There's still a spell on the view," said Tonino. "In that case," said Angelica, "let's just keep walking. There must be a road or a garden that we can't see." There certainly should have been something of the kind, but it neither felt nor looked like that. Tonino was sure he could sense vast hollow spaces below the cliff. There were no city sounds, and only a strangely musty smell. "Coward," said Angelica. "You go," said Tonino. "Only if you go too," she said. They hovered, glaring at one another. And as they hovered, the blaze of sunlight was cut off by an immense black shape. "Naughty," said a vast voice. "Bad children shall be punished." A force almost too strong to feel swept them away onto the fallen wall. The fallen wall rose briskly back into its place, sweeping Angelica and Tonino with it, helplessly sliding and rolling, until they thumped onto the painted carpet. By that time, Tonino was so breathless and dizzy that he hardly heard the wall snap back into place with a click. After that, the dizziness grew worse. Tonino knew he was in the grip of another spell. He struggled against it furiously, but whoever was casting it was immensely strong. He felt surging and bumping. The light from the windows changed, and changed again. Almost he could have sworn the room was being carried. It stopped with a jolt. He heard Angelica's voice, gabbling a prayer to Our Lady, and he did not blame her. Then there was a mystifying gap in what Tonino knew. He came to himself because whoever was casting the spell wanted him to. Tonino was quite sure of that. The punishment would not be so much fun unless Tonino knew about it. He was in a confusion of light and noise. There was a huge blur of it to one side, and he was racing up and down a narrow wooden platform, dragging, of all things, a string of sausages. He was wearing a bright red nightgown, and there was a heaviness on the front of his face. Each time he reached one end of the wooden platform, he found a white cardboard dog there with a frill around its neck. The dog's cardboard mouth opened and shut. It was making feeble cardboard attempts to get the sausages. The noise was terrific. Tonino seemed to be making some of it himself. "What a clever fellow! What a clever fellow!" he heard himself squawking, in a voice quite unlike his own. It was like the noise you make singing into paper over a comb. The rest of the noise was coming from the lighted space to one side. Vast voices were roaring and laughing, mixed with tinny music. "This is a dream," Tonino told himself, but he knew it was not. He had a fair idea what was happening, though his head still felt muzzy and his eyes were blurred. As he raced back down the little platform, he turned his bleary eyes inwards, towards the heaviness on his face. Sure enough, blurred and doubled, he could see a great red and pink nose there. He was Mr. Punch! Naturally, then, he tried to dig in his heels and stop racing up and down, and to lift his hand and wrench off the huge pink nose. He could not do either. More than that, whoever was making him Mr. Punch promptly took mean pleasure in making him run faster and whirl the sausages about harder. "Oh, very good!" yelled someone from the lighted space. Tonino thought he knew that voice. He sped towards the cardboard dog Toby again, whirled the sausages away from its cardboard jaws, and waited for his head and eyes to stop feeling so fuzzy. He was sure they would. The mean person wanted him conscious. "What a clever fellow!" he squawked. As he raced down the stage the other way, he snatched a look across his huge nose towards the lighted space, but it was a blur. So he snatched a look towards the other side. He saw the wall of a golden villa there, with 4 long windows. Beside each window stood a little dark cypress tree. Now he knew why the strange room had seemed so shoddy. It was only meant as scenery. The door on the outside wall was painted on. Between the villa and the stage was a hole. The person who was working the puppets ought to have been down there, but Tonino could only see empty blackness. It was all being done by magic. Just then he was distracted by a cardboard person diving upwards from the hole, squawking that Mr. Punch had stolen his sausages. Tonino was forced to stand still and squawk back. He was glad of a rest by then. Meanwhile, the cardboard dog seized the sausages and dived out of sight with them. The audience clapped and shouted, "Look at Dog Toby!" The cardboard person sped past Tonino, squawking that he would fetch the police. Once again, Tonino tried to look out at the audience. This time he could dimly see a brightly lit room and black, bulky shapes sitting in chairs, but it was like trying to see something against the sun. His eyes watered. A tear ran down the pink beak on his face. And Tonino could feel that the mean person was delighted to see that. He thought Tonino was crying. Tonino was annoyed, but also rather pleased. It looked as if the person could be fooled by his own mean thoughts. He stared out, in spite of the dazzle, trying to see the mean person. But all he could clearly see was a carving up near the roof of the lighted room. It was the Angel of Caprona, one hand held out in blessing, the other holding the scroll. Then he was jumped around to face Judy. On the other side of him, the wall had gone from the front of the villa. The scene was the room he knew only too well, with the chandelier artistically alight. Judy was coming along the stage, holding the white, rolled-up shape of the baby. Judy wore a blue nightdress and a blue cap. Her face was mauve, with a nose in the middle of it nearly as large and red as Tonino's. But the eyes on either side of it were Angelica's, alternately blinking and wide with terror. She blinked beseechingly at Tonino as she squawked, "I have to go out, Mr. Punch. Mind you mind the baby." "Don't want to mind the baby," he squawked. All through the long, silly conversation, he could see Angelica's eyes blinking at him, imploring him to think of a spell to stop this. But of course Tonino could not. He did not think Ronaldo or even Antonio could stop anything as powerful as this. "Angel of Caprona," he thought, "help us!" That made him feel better, although nothing stopped the spell. Angelica planted the baby in his arms and dived out of sight. The baby started to cry. Tonino first squawked abuse at it, then took it by the end of its long white dress and beat its brains out on the platform. The baby was much more realistic than Dog Toby. It may have been only cardboard, but it wriggled and waved its arms and cried most horribly. Tonino could almost have believed it was Cousin Claudia's baby. It so horrified him that he found he was repeating the words of the Angel of Caprona as he swung the baby up and down. And those might not have been the right words, but he could feel they were doing something. When he finally flung the white bundle over the front of the stage, he could see the shiny floor the baby fell on, away below. And when he looked up at the clapping spectators, he could see them too, equally clearly. The first person he saw was the Duke of Caprona. He was sitting on a gilded chair in a glitter of buttons, laughing gigantically. Tonino wondered how he could laugh like that at something so horrible, until he remembered that he had stood himself a score of times and laughed himself sick at just the same thing. But those had been only puppets. Then it dawned on Tonino that the Duke thought they were puppets. He was laughing at the skill of the showman.
"What a clever fellow!"
squawked Tonino, and was made to dance about gleefully, without wanting to in the least. But as he danced, he looked sharply at the rest of the audience to see who it was who knew he was not a puppet. To his terror, a good half of them knew. Tonino met a knowing look on the faces of the three grave men surrounding the Duke, and the same on the elegantly made-up faces of the two ladies with the Duchess. And the Duchess! As soon as Tonino saw the amused arch of the Duchess's eyebrows and the little secret smile on her mouth, he knew she was the one doing it. He looked her in the eyes. Yes, she was an enchantress. That was what had so troubled him about her when he saw her before. And the Duchess saw him look, and smiled less secretly, because Tonino could do nothing about it. That really frightened Tonino. But Angelica came swooping upwards again, with a large stick clutched in her arms, and he had no time to think.
"What have you done with the baby?"
squawked Angelica. And she belaboured Tonino with the stick. It really hurt. It knocked him to his knees, and went on bashing at him. Tonino could see Angelica's lips moving, though her silly, squeaky voice kept saying,
"I'll teach you to kill the baby."
Her mouth was forming the words of the Angel of Caprona. That was because she knew what came next. Tonino said the words of the angel, too, and tried to stay crouched on the floor. But it was no good. He was made to spring up, wrest the stick from Judy, and beat Angelica with it. He could see the Duke laughing and the courtiers smiling. The Duchess's smile was very broad now, because, of course, Tonino was going to have to beat Angelica to death. Tonino tried to hold the stick so that it would only hit Angelica lightly. She might be a Patrochi, and a thoroughly irritating girl, but she had not deserved this. But the stick leaped up and down of its own accord, and Tonino's arms went with it. Angelica fell on her knees and then on her face. Her squawks redoubled as Tonino smote away at her back. And then her voice stopped. She lay with her head hanging down from the front of the platform, looking just like a puppet. Tonino found himself having to kick her down the empty space between the false villa and the stage. He heard the distant flop as she fell. And then he was forced to skip and cackle with glee, while the Duchess threw back her head and laughed as heartily as the Duke. Tonino hated her. He was so angry and so miserable that he did not mind at all when a cardboard policeman appeared, and he chased him with the stick too. He laid into the policeman as if he was the Duchess, and not a cardboard doll at all. "Are you all right, Lucrezia?" he heard the Duke say. Tonino looked sideways as he dealt another mighty swipe at the policeman's cardboard helmet. He saw the Duchess wince as the stick landed. He was not surprised when the policeman was immediately whisked away, and he himself forced into a violent capering and even louder squawking. He let himself do it. He felt truly gleeful as he squawked,
"What a clever fellow!"
for what felt like the 1000th time. for he understood what had happened. The Duchess was the policeman in a sort of way. She was putting some of herself into all the puppets to make them work, but he must not let her know he knew. Tonino capered and chortled, doing his best to seem terrified, and kept his eyes on that carving of the angel high up over the door of the room. And now the hooded hangman puppet appeared, dragging a little wooden gibbet with a string noose dangling from it. Tonino capered cautiously. This was where the Duchess did for him unless he was very careful. On the other hand, if this Punch and Judy show went as it should, he might just do for the Duchess. The silly scene began. Tonino had never worked so hard at anything in his life. He kept repeating the words of the angel in his head, both as a kind of prayer and as a smokescreen, so that the Duchess would not understand what he was trying to do. At the same time, he thought fiercely and vengefully that the hangman was not just a puppet, it was the Duchess herself. And, also at the same time, he attended to Mr. Punch's conversation with all his might. This had to go right.
"Come along, Mr. Punch," croaked the hangman. "Just put your head in this noose."
How do I do that?
Asked Mr. Punch and Tonino, both pretending hard to be stupid.
"You put your head in here,"
croaked the hangman, putting one hand through the noose. Mr. Punch and Tonino, both of them quivering with cunning, put his head first one side of the noose, then the other.
Is this right? Is this?
Then, pretending even harder to be stupid,
I can't see how to do it. You'll have to show me.
either the Duchess was wanting to play with Tonino's feelings, or she was trying the same cunning. They went through this several times. Each time the hangman put his hand through the noose to show Mr. Punch what to do. Tonino did not dare look at the Duchess. He looked at the hangman and kept thinking, "That's the Duchess," and reciting the angel for all he was worth. At last, to his relief, the Duke became restive. "Come on, Mr. Punch," he shouted.
You'll have to put your head in and show me.
Mr. Punch and Tonino said, as persuasively as he knew how.
"Oh, well,"
croaked the hangman,
"since you're so stupid."
and he put his cardboard head through the noose. Mr. Punch and Tonino promptly pulled the rope and hanged him. But Tonino thought, "This is the Duchess," and went as limp and heavy as he could. For just a second, his full puppet's weight swung on the end of the rope. It only lasted that second. Tonino had a glimpse of the Duchess on her feet with her hands to her throat. He felt real triumph. Then he was thrown flat on his face across the stage, unable to move at all. There he was forced to lie. His head hung down from the front of the stage, so that he could see very little. But he gathered that the Duchess was being led tenderly away, with the Duke fussing around her. "I think I feel as pleased as Punch," he thought. Chapter 10. Paolo never wanted to remember that night afterwards. He was still staring at the sick yellow message in the yard when the rest of the family arrived. He was crowded aside to let old Niccolò and Aunt Francesca through, but Benvenuto spat at them like hot fat hitting fire and would not let them pass. "Let be, old boy," old Niccolò said. "You've done your best." He turned to Aunt Francesca. "I shall never forgive the Patrocchis," he said. "Never." Paolo was once again struck by how wretched and goblin-like his grandfather looked. He had thought old Niccolò was helping vast, panting, muddy Aunt Francesca along, but he now wondered if it was not the other way around.
"Well, let's get rid of this horrible message,"
old Niccolò said irritably to the rest of them. He raised his arms to start the family on the spell, and collapsed. His hands went to his chest, he slid to his knees, and his face was a strange colour. Paolo thought he was dead until he saw him breathing in uneven jerks. Elizabeth, Uncle Lorenzo, and Aunt Maria rushed to him. "Heart attack," Uncle Lorenzo said, nodding over at Antonio. "Get that spell going. We've got to get him indoors."
"Paolo, run for the doctor,"
said Elizabeth. As Paolo ran, he heard the burst of singing behind him. When he came back with the doctor, the message had vanished, and old Niccolò had been carried up to bed. Aunt Francesca, still muddy, with her hair hanging down one side, was roving up and down the yard like a moving mountain, crying and wringing her hands. "Spells are forbidden," she called out to Paolo. "I've stopped everything." "And a good thing, too," the doctor said sourly. "A man of Niccolò Montana's age has no business to be brawling in the streets. And make your great-aunt lie down," he said to Paolo. "She'll be in bed next." Aunt Francesca would only go to the saloon, where she refused even to sit down. She raged up and down, wailing about old Niccolò, weeping about Tonino, declaring that the virtue had gone from the Casa Montana for good, and uttering terrible threats against the Patrocchis. Nobody else was much better. The children cried with tiredness. Elizabeth and the aunts worried about old Niccolò, and then about Aunt Francesca. In the scriptorium, among all the abandoned spells, Antonio and the uncles sat rigid with worry, and the rest of the casa was full of older cousins wandering about and cursing the Patrocchis. Paolo found Rinaldo leaning moodily on the gallery rail, in spite of it being dark now and really quite cold. "Curse those Patrocchis," he said gloomily to Paolo. "We can't even earn a living now, let alone help if there's a war." Paolo, in spite of his misery, was very flattered that Rinaldo seemed to think him old enough to talk family business to. He said, "Yes, it's awful," and tried to lean on the rail in the same elegant attitude as Rinaldo. It was not easy, since Paolo was not nearly tall enough, but he leaned, and prepared the arguments he would use to persuade Rinaldo that Tonino was in the hands of an enemy enchanter. That was not easy either. Paolo knew that Rinaldo would not listen to him if he dropped the least small hint that he had talked to a Patrocchi, and besides, he would have died rather than told his cousin. But he knew that if he persuaded Rinaldo would rescue Tonino in 5 dashing minutes. Rinaldo was a true Montana. While he thought, Rinaldo said angrily, "What possessed that stupid brat Tonino to read that blessed book? I shall give him something to think about when we get him back." Paolo shivered in the cold. "Tonino always reads books." Then he shifted a bit. The elegant attitude was not at all comfortable, and asked timidly, "How shall we get him back?" This was not at all what he had planned to say. He was annoyed with himself. "What's the use?" Rinaldo said. "We know where he is, in the Casa Patrocchi, and if he's uncomfortable there, it's his own fault." "But he's not," Paolo protested. As far as he could see in the light from the yard lamp, Rinaldo turned and looked at him jeeringly. The discussion seemed to be getting further from the way he had planned it every second. "An enemy enchanter's got him," he said. "The one Chrestomanci talked about." Rinaldo laughed. Load of old crab-apples, Paolo. Our friend had been talking to the Patrocchis. He invented his convenient enchanter because he wanted us all working for Caprona. Most of us saw through it at once. Then who made that mist on the Corso? Paolo said. It wasn't us, and it wasn't them. But Ronaldo only said, Who said it wasn't them? As Paolo could not say it was Renata Patrocchi, he could not answer. Instead, he said rather desperately, Come with me to the Casa Patrocchi. If you use the finding spell, you could prove Tonino isn't there. What? Ronaldo seemed astounded. What kind of fool do you take me for, Paolo? I'm not going to take on a whole family of spellmakers single-handed. And if I go there and use a spell and they do something to Tonino, everyone's going to blame me, aren't they? For something we know anyway. It's not worth it, Paolo. But I tell you what. He was interrupted by Aunt Gina trumpeting below in the yard. Notti's is the only chemist open by now. Tell him it's for Niccolò Montana. With some relief, Paolo dropped the elegant attitude entirely and leaned over the rail to watch Lucia and Corina hurry through the yard with the doctor's prescription. The sight gave his stomach a wrench of worry. Do you think old Niccolò's going to die, Ronaldo? Ronaldo shrugged. Could be. He's pretty old. It's about time the old idiot gave up anyway. I shall be one step closer to being head of the Casa Montana then. A peculiar thing happened inside Paolo's head then. He had never given much thought to who might follow Antonio, for it was clear his father would follow old Niccolò as head of the Casa Montana. But he had never, for some reason, thought it might be Ronaldo. Now he tried to imagine Ronaldo doing the things old Niccolò did. And as soon as he did, he saw Ronaldo was quite unsuitable. Ronaldo was vain and selfish and cowardly, provided he could be a coward and still keep up a good appearance. It was as if Ronaldo had set a powerful spell to clear Paolo's eyes. It never occurred to Ronaldo, expert spellmaker though he was, that a few ordinary words could make such a difference. He bent towards Paolo and dropped his voice to a melodious murmur. I was going to tell you, Paolo. I'm going around enlisting all the young ones. We're going to swear to work a secret revenge on the Patrocchis. We'll do something worse than make them eat their words. Are you with me? Will you swear to join the plan? Maybe he was in earnest. It would suit Ronaldo to work in secret, with lots of willing helpers. But Paolo was sure that this plan was a step in Ronaldo's plans to be head of the Casa. Paolo sidled away along the rail. Are you game? Ronaldo whispered, laughing a little. Paolo sidled beyond grabbing distance. Tell you later. He turned and scudded away. Ronaldo laughed and did not try to catch him. He thought Paolo was scared. Paolo went down into the yard, feeling more lonely than he had felt in his life. Tonino was not there. Tonino was not vain or selfish or cowardly, and nobody would help him find Tonino. Paolo had not noticed until now how much he depended on Tonino. They did everything important together. Even if Paolo was busy on his own, he knew Tonino was there somewhere, sitting reading, ready to put his book down if Paolo needed him. Now there seemed to be nothing for Paolo to do, and the whole casa reeked of worry. He went to the kitchen, where there seemed at last to be something happening. All his small cousins were there. Rosa and Marco were trying to make soup for them. "Come in and help, Paolo," Rosa said. We're going to put them to bed after soup, but we're having a bit of trouble." Both she and Marco were looking tired and flustered. Most of the little ones were grizzling, including the baby. The trouble was Lucia's spell. Paolo understood this because Marco dumped the baby in his arms. Its wrapper was covered with orange grease. "Yuck," said Paolo. "I know," said Rosa. "Well, Marco, better try again. Clean saucepan, clean water. The very last packet of soup powder. Don't make that face, Paolo. We've got through all the vegetables. They just sail away to the waste bins, and they're mouldy before they get there." Paolo looked nervously at the door, wondering if the enemy enchanter was powerful enough to overhear him. "Try a cancel spell," he whispered. "Aunt Gina went through them all this afternoon," said Rosa. "No good. Little Lucia used the angel of Caprona, you see. We're trying Marco's way now. Ready, Marco?" Rosa opened the packet of soup and held it over the saucepan. As the dry pink powder poured into the water, Marco leaned over the saucepan and sang furiously. Paolo watched them nervously. This was just what the message told them not to do, he was sure. When all the powder was in the water, Rosa and Marco peered anxiously into the saucepan. "Have we done it?" asked Marco. "I think—" Rosa began, and ended in a yell of exasperation. "Oh, no!" The little pasta shells in the powder had turned into real seashells, little grey ones. "With creatures in!" Rosa said despairingly, dipping a spoonful out. "Where is Lucia?" she said. "Bring her here. Tell her I—" "No, don't. Just fetch her, Paolo." "She's gone to the chemist," said Paolo. There was shouting in the yard. Paolo passed the greasy baby to the nearest cousin and shot outside, dreading another sick yellow message about Tonino. Or there was just a chance the noise was Lucia. It was neither. It was Rinaldo. The uncles must have left the scriptorium, for Rinaldo was making a bonfire of spells in the middle of the yard. Domenico, Carlo, and Luigi were busily carrying armfuls of scripts, envelopes, and scrolls down from the gallery. Paolo recognized, already curling among the flames, the army charms he and the other children had spent such a time copying. It was a shocking waste of work. "This is what the Patrokis have forced us to," shouted Rinaldo, striking an attitude beside the flames. It was evidently part of his plan to enlist the young ones. Paolo was glad to see Antonio and Uncle Lorenzo hurry out of the saloon. "Rinaldo!" shouted Antonio. "Rinaldo, we're worried about Umberto. We want you to go to the university and inquire." "Send Domenico," said Rinaldo, and turned back to the flames. "No," said Antonio. "You go." There was something about the way he said it that caused Rinaldo to back away from him. "I'll go," said Rinaldo. He held up one hand, laughing. "I was only joking, Uncle Antonio." He left at once. "Take those spells back," Uncle Lorenzo said to the other three cousins. "I hate to see good work wasted." Domenico, Carlo, and Luigi obeyed without a word. Antonio and Uncle Lorenzo went to the bonfire and tried to stamp out the flames, but they were burning too strongly. Paolo saw them look at one another rather guiltily, and then lean forward and whisper a spell over the fire. It flicked out as if it had been turned off with a switch. Paolo sighed worriedly. It was plain that no one in the Casa Montana could drop the habit of using spells. He wondered how long it would be before the enemy enchanter noticed. "Fetch a light," Antonio shouted to Domenico, "and sort out the ones that aren't burned." Paolo went back to the kitchen before they asked him to help. The bonfire had given him an idea. "There is quite a bit of mince," Rosa was saying. "Dare we try with that?" "Why don't you," said Paolo, "take the food to the dining room? I'll light a fire there, and you can cook it on that." "The boy's a genius," said Marco. They did that. Rosa cooked by relays, and Marco made cocoa. The children were fed first, Paolo included. Paolo sat on one of the long benches, thinking it was almost enjoyable, except if he thought of Tonino or old Niccolò in bed upstairs. He was very pleased and surprised when a sudden bundle of claw and warm iron muscle landed on his knee. Benvenuto was missing Tonino, too. He rubbed against Paolo with a kind of desperation, but he would not purr. Rosa and Marco were getting up to put the young ones to bed, when there was a sudden great clanging outside in the night. "Good heavens!" said Rosa, and opened the yard door. The noise flooded in, an uneven metal sound, hasty and huge. The nearest clang, clang, clang was so near that it could only be the bell of St. Angelo's. Behind it, the bell of the cathedral tolled. And beyond that, now near, now faint and tinny, every bell in every church in Caprona beat and boomed and clashed and chimed. Corina and Lucia came racing in, their faces bright with cold and excitement. "We're at war! The Duke's declared war!" Marco said he thought he had better go. "Oh, no, don't!" Rosa cried out. "Not yet. By the way, Lucia—" Lucia took a quick look at the cooking in the hearth. "I'll go and take Aunt Gina the prescription," she said, and prudently ran away. Marco and Rosa looked at one another. "3 states against us and no spells to fight with," said Marco. "We're not likely to have a long and happy marriage, are we?" "Mr. Notti says the final reserve is being called up tomorrow," Corina said encouragingly. She caught Rosa's eye. "Come on, you kids," she said to 4 cousins at random. "Bedtime." While the young ones were being put to bed, Paolo sat nursing Benvenuto, feeling more dismal than ever. He wondered if there would be soldiers from Florence and Pisa and Siena in Caprona by tomorrow. Would guns fire in the streets? He thought of big marble chips shot off the cathedral, the new bridge broken, despite all the spells in it, and swore the enemy soldiers dragging Rosa off, screaming. And he saw that all this could really have happened by the end of the week. Here he became quite certain that Benvenuto was trying to tell him something. He could tell from the accusing stare of Benvenuto's yellow eyes. But he simply could not understand. "I'll try," he said to Benvenuto. "I really will try." He had, fleetingly, the feeling that Benvenuto was glad. Encouraged by this, Paolo bent his head and stared at Benvenuto's urgent face. But it did no good. All that Paolo could get out of it was a picture in his mind, a picture of somewhere with a coloured marble front, very large and beautiful. "The Church of St. Angelo?" he said doubtfully. While Benvenuto's tail was still lashing with annoyance, Rosa and Marco came back. "Oh, dear," Rosa said to Marco. "There's Paolo taking all the troubles of the casa on his shoulders again." Paolo looked up in surprise. Marco said, "You look just like Antonio sometimes." "I can't understand Benvenuto," Paolo said despairingly. Marco sat on the table beside him. "Then he'll have to find some other way of telling us what he wants," he said. "He's a clever cat, the cleverest I've ever known. He'll do it." He put out a hand, and Benvenuto let him stroke his head. "Your ears," said Marco, "Sir Cat, are like sea holly without the prickles." Rosa perched on the table too, on the other side of Paolo. "What is it, Paolo? Tonino?" Paolo nodded. "Nobody will believe me that the enemy enchanters got him." "We do," said Marco. Rosa said, "Paolo, it's just as well he's got Tonino and not you. Tonino will take it much more calmly." Paolo was a little bewildered. "Why do you two believe in the enchanter and no one else does?" "What makes you think he exists?" Marco countered. Even to Rosa and Marco, Paolo could not bring himself to tell of his embarrassing encounter with a Petrocchi. "There was a horrible fog at the end of the fight," he said. Rosa and Marco jumped around delightedly. Their hands met with a smack over Paolo's head. "It worked! It worked!" And Marco added, "We were hoping someone would mention a certain fog. Did there seem to have been a large-scale cancel spell with it by any chance?" "Yes," said Paolo. "We made that fog," Rosa said. "Marco and me. We were hoping to stop the fighting, but it took us ages to make it because all the magic in Caprona was going into the fight." Paolo digested this. That took care of the one piece of proof that did not depend on the word of a Petrocchi. Perhaps the enchanter did not exist after all. Perhaps Tonino really was at the Casa Petrocchi. He remembered that Renata had not said Angelica was missing until the fog cleared and she knew who he was. "Look," he said, "will you two come to the Casa Petrocchi with me and see if Tonino's there?" He was aware that Rosa and Marco were exchanging some kind of look above his head. "Why?" said Rosa. "Because," said Paolo, "because—" The need to persuade them cleared his wits at last. "Because Guido Petrocchi said Angelica Petrocchi was missing too." "I'm afraid we can't," Marco said, with what sounded like real regret. "You'd understand if you knew how pressing our reasons are, believe me." Paolo did not understand. He knew that with these two it was not cowardice or pride or anything like that. That only made it more maddening. "Oh, nobody will help!" he cried out. Rosa put her arm around him. "Paolo, you're just like father. You think you have to do everything yourself. There is one thing we can do." "Call Chrestomanci?" said Marco. Paolo felt Rosa nod. "But he's in Rome," he objected. "It doesn't matter," said Marco. "He's that kind of enchanter. If he's near enough and you need him enough, he comes when you call." "I must cook," said Rosa, jumping off the table. Just before the second supper was ready, Rinaldo came back in great good spirits. Uncle Umberto and old Luigi Petrocchi had had another fight in the dining hall of the university. That was why Uncle Umberto had not turned up to see how old Niccolò was. He and Luigi were both in bed, prostrated with exhaustion. Rinaldo had been drinking wine with some students who told him all about the fight. The students' supper had been ruined. Cutlets and pasta had flown about, followed by chairs, tables, and benches. Umberto had tried to drown Luigi in a soup tureen, and Luigi had replied by hurling the whole of the doctor's supper at Umberto. The students were going on strike. They did not mind the fight, but Luigi had shown them that the doctor's food was better than theirs. Paolo listened without truly attending. He was thinking about Tonino, and wondering if he dared depend on the word of a Petrocchi. Chapter 11. After a while, someone came and picked Tonino up. That was unpleasant. His legs and arms dragged and dangled in all directions, and he could not do anything about it. He was plunged somewhere much darker. Then he was left to lie, amid a great deal of bumping and scraping, as if he were in a box which was being pushed across a floor. When it stopped, he found he could move. He sat up, trembling all over. He was in the same room as before, but it seemed to be much smaller. He could tell that if he stood up, his head would brush the little lighted chandelier in the ceiling. So he was larger now. Where he had been 3 inches tall before, he must now be more like 9. The puppets must be too big for their scenery, and the false villa meant to look as if it was some distance away. And with the Duchess suddenly taken ill, none of her helpers had bothered what size Tonino was. They had simply made sure he was shut up again. "Tonino," whispered Angelica. Tonino whirled around. Half the room was full of a pile of lax puppet bodies. He scanned the cardboard head of the policeman, then his enemy the hangman, and the white sausage of the baby, and came upon Angelica's face halfway up the pile. It was her own face, though swollen and tear-stained. Tonino clapped his hand to his nose. To his relief, the red beak was gone, though he still seemed to be wearing Mr. Punch's scarlet nightgown. "I'm sorry," he said. His teeth seemed to be chattering. "I tried not to hurt you. Are your bones broken?" "No," said Angelica. She did not sound too sure. "Tonino, what happened?" "I hanged the Duchess," Tonino said, and he felt some vicious triumph as he said it. "I didn't kill her, though," he added regretfully. Angelica laughed. She laughed until the heap of puppets was shaking and sliding about. But Tonino could not find it funny. He burst into tears, even though he was crying in front of a Patrochi. "Oh, dear," said Angelica. "Tonino, stop it! Tonino, please!" She struggled out from among the puppets and hobbled, looming, through the room. Her head banged the chandelier and sent it tinkling and casting mad shadows over them as she knelt down beside Tonino. "Tonino, please stop. She'll be furious as soon as she feels better." Angelica was wearing Judy's blue cap and Judy's blue dress still. She took off the cap and held it out to Tonino. "Here, blow on that. I used the baby's dress. It made me feel better." She tried to smile at him, but the smile went hopelessly crooked in her swollen face. Angelica's large forehead must have hit the floor first. It was now enlarged by a huge red bump. Under it, the grin looked grotesque. Tonino understood it was meant for a smile, and smiled back, as well as he could for his chattering teeth. "Here." Angelica loomed back through the room to the pile of puppets and heaved at the hangman. She returned with his black felt cape. "Put this on." Tonino wrapped himself in the cape and blew his nose on the blue cap, and felt better. Angelica heaved more puppets about. "I'm going to wear the policeman's jacket," she said. "Tonino, have you thought?" "Not really," said Tonino. "I sort of know." He had known from the moment he looked at the Duchess. She was the enchanter who was sapping the strength of Caprona and spoiling the spells of the Casa Montana. Tonino was not sure about the Duke. Probably he was too stupid to count. But in spite of the Duchess's enchantments, the spells of the Casa Montana and the Casa Patrochi must still be strong enough to be a nuisance to her. So he and Angelica had been kidnapped to blackmail both houses into stopping making spells. And if they stopped, Caprona would be defeated. The frightening part was that Tonino and Angelica were the only two people who knew, and the Duchess did not care that they knew. It was not only that even someone as clever as Paolo would never think of looking in the palace inside a Punch and Judy show. It must mean that the two of them would be dead before anyone found them. "We absolutely have to get away," said Angelica, "before she's better from being hanged." "She'll have thought of that," said Tonino. "I'm not sure," said Angelica. "I could tell everyone was startled to death. They let me see you being put through the floor, and I think we could get out that way. It will be easier now we're bigger." Tonino fastened the cape around him and struggled to his feet, though he felt almost too tired and bruised to bother. His head hit the chandelier, too. Huge, flickering shadows fled around the room and made the heap of puppets look as if they were squirming about. "Where did they put me through?" he said. "Just where you're standing," said Angelica. Tonino backed against the windows and looked at the place. He would not have known there was any opening, but now Angelica had told him he could see, disguised by the painted swirls of the carpet and confused by the swinging light, the faintest black line. The outline made an oblong about the size of the shoddy dining table. The tray of supper must have come through that way, too. "Sing an opening spell," Angelica commanded him. "I don't know one," Tonino was forced to confess. He could tell by the stiff way Angelica stood that she was trying not to say a number of nasty things. "Well, I don't dare," she said. "You saw what happened last time. If I do anything, they'll catch us again and punish us by making us be puppets, and I couldn't bear another time." Tonino was not sure he could bear it either, even though, now he thought about it, he was not sure it had been a punishment. The Duchess had probably intended to make them perform anyway. She was quite mean enough. On the other hand, he was not sure he could stand another of Angelica's botched spells either. "Well, it's only a trapdoor," he said. "It must be held up by one of those little hooks. Let's try bashing at it with the candlesticks." "And if there's a spell on it?" said Angelica. "Oh, come on, let's try." They seized a candlestick each and knelt beside the windows, knocking diligently at the scarcely seen black line. The cardboard was tough and pulpy. The candlesticks shortly looked like metal weeping willow trees. But they succeeded in making a crumbly hollow in the middle of one edge of the hidden door. Tonino thought he could see a glimmer of metal showing. He raised his bent candlestick high to deliver a mighty blow. "Stop!" hissed Angelica. There were large, shuffling footsteps somewhere. Tonino lowered the candlestick by gentle fractions and scarcely dared breathe. A distant voice grumbled, "Mice, then. Nothing here." It was suddenly very much darker. Someone had switched off a light, leaving them only with the bluish glimmer of the little chandelier. The footsteps shuffled, a door bumped, and there was silence. Angelica laid her candlestick down and began trying to tear at the cardboard with her fingers. Tonino got up and wandered away. It was no good. Someone was going to hear them, whatever they did. The palace was full of footmen and soldiers. Tonino would have given up then and waited for the Duchess to do her worst. Only now he was standing up, the cardboard room seemed so small. Half of it was filled with the puppets. There was hardly room to move. Tonino wanted to hurl himself at the walls and scream. He did make a movement and knocked the table. Because he was so much bigger and heavier now, the table swayed and creaked. "I know," he said. "Finish drawing the angel." The bump on Angelica's forehead turned up to him. "I'm not in the mood for doodling." "Not a doodle, a spell," Tonino explained. "And then pull the table over us while we make a hole in the trapdoor." Angelica did not need telling that the angel was the most potent spell in Caprona. She threw the candlestick aside and scrambled up. "That might just work," she said. "You know, for a Montana, you have very good ideas." Her head hit the chandelier again. In the confusion of swinging shadows, they could not find the tap Angelica had been drawing with. Tonino had to jam his head and arm into the tiny bathroom and pull off the other useless tap. Even when the shadows stopped swinging, the angel scratched on the table was hard to see. It now looked faint and small. "He needs his scroll," said Angelica, "and I'd better put in a halo to make sure he's holy." Angelica was now so much bigger and stronger that she kept dropping the tap. The halo, when she had scratched it in, was too big, and the scroll would not go right. The table swayed this way and that, the tap ploughed and skidded, and there was a danger the angel would end up a complete mess. "It's so fiddly," said Angelica. "Will that do?" "No," said Tonino. "It needs the scroll more unrolled. Some of the words show on our angel." Because he was quite right, Angelica lost her temper. "All right, do it yourself if you're so clever, you horrible Montana!" She held the tap out to Tonino, and he snatched it from her, quite as angry. "Here," he said, ploughing up a long curl of varnish. "Here's the hanging bit, and the words go sideways. You can see Carmen Pa, Venit Ang, Cap, and a lot more. But there won't be room for it." "Our angel," said Angelica, "says si seculare, elus cantare, and virtus data near the end." Tonino scratched away and took no notice. It was hard enough shaping tiny letters with a thing like a tap without listening to Angelica arguing. "Well, it does," said Angelica. "I've often wondered why it's not the words we sing—" The same idea came to both of them. They stared at one another, nose to nose across the scratched varnish. "Finding the words means looking for them," said Tonino. "And they were over our gates all the time. Oh, how stupid!" exclaimed Angelica. "Come on, we must get out now." Tonino left the scroll with Carmen scraped on it. There was really no room for any more. They dragged the creaking, swaying table across the hole they had made in the floor and set to work underneath it, hacking lumps out of the painted floor. Shortly they could see a bar of silvery metal stretching from the trapdoor to the floor underneath them. Tonino forced the end of his candlestick down between the battered cardboard edges and heaved sideways at the metal. "There's a spell on it," he said. "Angel of Caprona," Angelica said at the same moment. And the bar slipped sideways. A big, oblong piece of the floor dropped away from in front of their knees and swung, leaving a very deep, dark hole. "Let's get the hangman's rope," said Angelica. They edged along to the pile of puppets and disentangled the string from the little gibbet. Tonino tied it to the table leg. "It's a long way down," he said dubiously. "It's only a few feet, really," Angelica said, "and we're not heavy enough to hurt. I went all floppy when you kicked me off the stage and, well, I didn't break anything anyway." Tonino let Angelica go first, swinging down into the dark space like an energetic blue monkey. Crunch went the shoddy table. Creak! And it swayed towards the leg where the rope was tied. "Angel of Caprona," Tonino whispered. The table plunged one corner first, down into the space. The cardboard room rattled, and with a rending and creaking of wood, the table stuck, mostly in the hole, but with one corner out and wedged against the sides. There was a thump from below. Tonino was fairly sure he was stuck in the room for good now. "I'm down," Angelica whispered up. "You can pull the rope up. It nearly reaches the floor." Tonino leaned over and fumbled the string up from the table leg. He was sure there had been a miracle. That leg ought to have broken off, or the table ought to have gone down the hole. He whispered "Angel of Caprona" again as he slid down under the table into the dark. The table creaked hideously, but it held together. The string burned Tonino's hands as he slid, and then it was suddenly not there. His feet hit the floor almost at once. "Oof!" he went. His feet felt as if they had been knocked up through his legs. Down there, they were standing on the shiny floor of a palace room. The towering walls of the Punch and Judy show were on 3 sides of them. Instead of a back wall, there was a curtain, intended to hide the puppet master, and very dim light was coming in around its edges. They pulled one end of the curtain aside. It felt coarse and heavy, like a sack. Behind it was the wall of the room. The puppet show had evidently been simply pushed away to one side. There was just space for Angelica and Tonino to squeeze past the ends of the show into a large room lit by moonlight falling in strong silver blocks across its shiny floor. It was the same room where the court had watched the Punch and Judy show. The puppet show had not been put away. Tonino thought of the time he and Angelica had tottered on the edge of the stage, looking into nothingness. They could have been killed. That seemed another miracle. Then they must have been in some kind of storeroom. But when the Duchess was so mysteriously taken ill, no one had bothered to put them back there. The moonlight glittered on the polished face of the angel, high up on the other side of the room, leaning out over some big double doors. There were other doors, but Tonino and Angelica set out without hesitation towards the angel. Both of them took it for a guide. "Oh, bother," said Angelica, before they reached the first block of moonlight. "We're still small. I thought we'd be the right size as soon as we got out, didn't you?" Tonino's one idea was to get out, whatever his size. "It'll be easier to hide like this," he said. "Someone in your casa can easily turn you back." He pulled the hangman's cloak around him and shivered. It was colder out in the big room. He could see the moon through the big windows, riding high and cold in a wintry, dark blue sky. It was not going to be fun running through the streets in a red nightgown. "But I hate being this small," Angelica complained. "We'll never be able to get downstairs." She was right to complain, as Tonino soon discovered. It seemed a mile across the polished floor. When they reached the double doors, they were tired out. High above them, the carved angel dangled a scroll they could not possibly read, and no longer looked so friendly. But the doors were open a crack. They managed to push the crack wider by leaning their backs against the edge of both doors. It was maddening to think they could have opened them with one hand if only they had been the proper size. Beyond was an even bigger room. This one was full of chairs and small tables. The only advantage of being doll-sized was that they could walk under every piece of furniture in a straight line to the far too distant door. It was like trudging through a golden, moonlit forest, where every tree had an elegant swan bend to its trunk. The floor seemed to be marble. Before they reached the door, they were quarrelling again from sheer tiredness. "It's going to take all night to get out of here," Angelica grumbled. "Oh, shut up," said Tonino. "You make more fuss about things than my Aunt Gina." "Is your Aunt Gina bruised all over because you hit her?" Angelica demanded. When they came to the half-open door at last, there was only another room, slightly smaller. This one had a carpet. Gilded sofas stood about like Dutch barns, and large, frilly armchairs. Angelica gave a wail of despair. Tonino stood on tiptoe. There seemed to be cushions on some of the seats. "Suppose we hid under a cushion for the night," he suggested, trying to make peace. Angelica turned on him furiously. "Stupid! No wonder you're slow at spells. We may be small, but they'll find us because of that. We must stink of magic. Even my baby brother could find us, and he may be a baby, but he's cleverer than you." Tonino was too angry to answer. He simply marched away into the carpet. At first, it was a relief to his sore feet, but it soon became another trial. It was like walking through long, tufty grass, and anyone who has done that for a mile or so will know how tiring that can be. On top of that, they had to keep going around puffy armchairs that seemed as big as houses, frilly footstools, and screens as big as hoardings. Some of these things would have made good hiding places, but they were both too angry and frightened to suggest it. Then, when they reached the door at last, it was shut. They threw themselves against the hard wood. It did not even shake. "Now what?" said Tonino, leaning his back against it. The moon was going down by now. The carpet was in darkness. The bars of moonlight from the far-off windows only touched the tops of armchairs, or picked out the gold on the sofa backs, or the glitter from a shelf of coloured glass vases. It would be quite dark soon. "There's an angel over there," Angelica said wearily. She was right. Tonino could just see it, as coloured flickers on wood, lit by moonlight reflected off the shelf of glass vases. There was another door under the angel, or rather a dark space, because that door was wide open. Too tired even to speak, Tonino set off again, across another mile of tufty carpet, past beetling cliffs of furniture, to the other side of the room. By the time they reached that open door, they were so tired that nothing seemed real any more. There were 4 steps down beyond the door. Very well. They went down them somehow. At the bottom was an even more brutally tufted carpet, and the window here was on the other side from the moon. It was quite dark. Angelica sniffed the darkness. Cigars. It could have been Scylla's for all Tonino cared. All he wanted was the next door. He set off, feeling around the walls for it, with Angelica stumbling after. They bumped into one huge piece of furniture, felt their way around it, and banged into another, which stuck even farther into the room. And so they went, stumbling and banging, climbing across 2 rounded metal bars, wading in carpet, until they arrived at the 4 steps again. It was quite a small room for the palace, and it had only one door. Tonino felt for the first step as high as his head, and did not think he had the strength to get up them again. The angel had not been a guide after all. "That part that stuck out," said Angelica. "I don't know what it was, but it was hollow, like a box. Shall we risk hiding in it?" "Let's find it," said Tonino. They found it, or something like it, by walking into it. It was a steep-sided box, which came up to their armpits. There was a large piece of metal, like a very wide door-knocker, hung on the front of it. When they felt inside, they felt sheets of stiff leather, and crisper stuff that was possibly paper. "I think it's an open drawer," said Tonino. Angelica did not answer. She simply climbed in. Tonino heard her flapping and crackling among the paper, if it was paper. Well, he thought. And it was Angelica who said they smelled of magic. But he was so tired that he climbed in too, and fell into a warm, crumply nest where Angelica was already asleep. Tonino was almost too tired by now to care if they were found or not, but he had the sense to drag a piece of parchment over them both, before he went to sleep too. Tonino woke up, feeling chilly and puzzled. The light was pale and yellow, because his sheet seemed to be over his face. Tonino gazed up at it, thinking it was a surprisingly flat, stiff sheet. It had large black letters on it, too. His eyes travelled along the letters. "Declaration of War, duplicate copy," he read. Then he knew with a jump that he was 9 inches high and lying in a drawer in the palace. And it was light. Someone would find them. In fact, someone nearly had. That was what had woken him. He could hear someone moving about the room, making obscure thumps and shuffles, and occasionally whistling a snatch of the Angel of Caprona. Whoever it was had reached the drawer now. Tonino could hear the floor creak under him, and a dress rustling loud and near. He moved his head gently and stiffly, and found Angelica's frightened face resting on crumpled paper an inch or so away. The rustling dress proved the person was a woman. It must be the Duchess looking for them. "That Duke," said the person, in a voice no Duchess would use. "There never was such an untidy man." Her breathing came suddenly nearer. Before either Tonino or Angelica could think what to do, the drawer moved. Helplessly, they were shunted inwards, feet first, into darkness, and the drawer shut with a bang behind their heads. "Help!" whispered Angelica. "Shh!" The maid was still in the room. They could hear her move something, and then a tinkle of notes as she dusted a piano. Then a bump, and finally nothing. When they were quite sure she was gone, Angelica whispered, "What do we do now?" There was room to sit up in the drawer, but not much else. Above their heads was a slit of light where the drawer met the desk, or whatever it was, and no way of opening it. But they could see quite well. Light was coming in at the back, beyond their feet. They tried bracing their hands against the wood overhead and heaving, but the drawer was made of solid, spicy-smelling wood, and they could not budge it. "We keep being shut in places without doors!" Angelica cried out, and she went floundering through the papers to the back of the drawer, where the light came in. Tonino crawled after her. As soon as they got there, they realized this was the way out. The end of the drawer was lower than the front, and it did not reach the back of the wooden desk it was part of. There was quite a big gap there. When they put their heads into the space, they could see the ends of the other drawers above theirs going up like a ladder, and a slit of daylight at the top. They squeezed through into the gap and climbed side by side. It was as easy as climbing a ladder. They were one drawer away from the slit of daylight, which was going to be a tight squeeze, when they heard someone else in the room. "They came down here, madam," said a lady's voice. "Then we've caught them," replied the Duchess. "Look very carefully." Tonino and Angelica hung from the back of the drawers by their fingers and toes, not daring to move. Silk dresses rustled as the Duchess and her lady moved around the room. "There's nothing this end at all, madam." "And I swear this window hasn't been opened," said the Duchess. "Open all the drawers in the desk." There was a sharp rumble above Tonino's head. Dusty white light flooded down from the open top drawer, Papers were loudly tossed over. "Nothing," said the lady. The top drawer slammed in again. Tonino and Angelica had been hanging on to the second drawer. They climbed down to the next as fast and quietly as they could. The second drawer rumbled open and slammed shut, nearly deafening them. The drawer they were on jerked. Luckily, it was stiff. The lady tugged and rattled at it, and that gave Tonino and Angelica just time to climb frantically up to the second drawer again and cling there. And there they hung, in the dark, narrow space, while the lady opened the third drawer, slammed it shut, and pulled out the bottom drawer. They craned over their arms and watched the white light flood in from below. "Look at this!" cried the lady. "They've been here! It's like a mouse nest!" Silks rustled as the Duchess hurried over. "Curse it!" she said. "Not long ago, too. I can smell them even through the cigars. Quick, they can't be far away. They must have got out before the room was cleaned." The drawer rumbled in, bringing dusty darkness with it. There was a flurry of silks as the two women hurried away up the steps to the room with the armchairs, and the quiet, firm clap of the door closing. "Do you think it's a trap?" Angelica whispered. "No," said Tonino. He was sure the Duchess had not guessed where they were. But they were shut in this room now, by the sound, and he had no idea how they would get the door open. All the same, even a shut room was great open spaces compared with the narrow slit at the back of the drawers. Angelica and Tonino pushed and squeezed and forced themselves through the narrow daylight slit and finally crawled out on the top of a writing desk. Before their eyes had got used to the light, Tonino stubbed his toe on a vast pen like a telegraph pole and then tripped over a paper knife like an ivory plank. Angelica bumped into a china ornament standing at the back of the desk. It swayed, she flung her arms around it. When her eyes stopped watering, she found she was hugging a china Mr. Punch, nose, red nightgown and all, about the same height as she was. There was a china Judy standing at the other end of the desk. "We can't get away from these things," she said. The desk was covered in smooth, red leather, very easy on the feet, and held a huge white blotter, which was even more comfortable to walk on. A chair with a matching red seat stood in front of the desk. Tonino saw they could easily jump down onto it. Even more easily, they could climb down the handles of the drawers. On the other hand, the piano the maid had dusted stood right beside the desk, and the window was around the corner from the piano. To reach the window was only a long stride from the piano. Though the window was shut, it had quite an easy-looking catch, if only they could reach it. "Look!" said Angelica, pointing disgustedly. A whole row of Punch and Judys stood along the top of the piano. Two were puppets on stands, very old and valuable by the look of them. Two more were actually made of gold, and two others were rather arty clay models, which made Punch look like a leering ordinary man, and Judy uncomfortably like the Duchess. And the music, which was open on the piano, was headed Arnolfini, Punch and Judy Suite. "I think this is the Duke's study," said Angelica. And both of them got the giggles. Still giggling, Tonino stepped onto the piano and started to walk to the window. "Do, ti, so, fa," went the piano. "Come back!" Angelica laughed. Tonino came back, fa, so, ti, do, nearly in hysterics. The door of the room opened, and someone hurried down the steps. Angelica and Tonino could think of nothing better to do than stand stiffly where they were, hoping to be taken for more Punch and Judys. And luckily the man who came in was busy and worried. He slapped a pile of papers on the desk without so much as glancing at the two new puppets, and hurried out again, gently closing the door behind him. "Phew," said Angelica. They walked around to the front of the papers and looked at them curiously. The top one said, "Report of campaign at 0800 hours. Summary. Troops advancing on all fronts to repel invasion. Heavy artillery and reservists moving up in support. Pisan front reports heavy losses. Fleet sighted. Pisan, steaming for mouth of Voltava." "We're at war," said Tonino. "Why?" "Because the Duchess has got us, of course," said Angelica. "And our families daren't make war spells. Tonino, we must get out. We must tell them where the words to the angel are." "But why does the Duchess want Caprona beaten?" Tonino said. "I don't know," said Angelica. "There's something wrong about her, I know that. Aunt Bela said there was an awful fuss when the Duke decided to marry her. Nobody likes her." "Let's see if we can open the window," said Tonino. He set off along the piano again. "Do, ti, sol, fa, mi, re." "Quiet," said Angelica. Tonino discovered that if he put each foot down very slowly, the notes did not sound. He was halfway along the keyboard, and Angelica had one foot stretched out to follow, when they heard someone opening the door again. There was no time to be careful. Angelica fled back to the desk. Tonino, with a terrible discord, scrambled across the black notes and squeezed behind the music on the stand. He was only just in time. When he looked, he was standing with his feet and head sideways like an ancient Egyptian. The Duke of Caprona himself was standing in front of the desk. Tonino thought the Duke seemed both puzzled and sad. He was tapping the report of campaign against his teeth, and did not seem to notice Angelica standing between the Punch and the Judy on his desk, although Angelica's eyes were blinking against the glitter from the Duke's buttons. "But I didn't declare war," the Duke said to himself. "I was watching that puppet show. How could I—" He sighed, and bit the report worriedly between two rows of big, shiny teeth. "Is my mind going?" he asked. He seemed to be talking to Angelica. She had the sense not to answer. "I must go and ask Lucrezia," the Duke said. He flung the report down at Angelica's feet and hurried out of the study. Tonino slid cautiously down the piano lid onto the keys again. Kerpling! Angelica was now standing at the end of the piano, pointing at the window. She was speechless with horror. Tonino looked, and for a moment he was as frightened as Angelica. There was a brown monster glaring at him through the glass, wide-faced, wide-eyed, and shaggy. The thing had eyes like yellow lamps. Faintly through the glass came a slightly irritable request to pull himself together and open the window. "Benvenuto!" shouted Tonino. "Oh, it's only a cat," Angelica quavered. "How terrible it must feel to be a mouse." "Just a cat," Tonino said scornfully. "That's Benvenuto." He tried to explain to Benvenuto that it was not easy to open windows when you were 9 inches high. Benvenuto's impatient answer was to shove Tonino's latest magic exercise book in front of Tonino's mind's eye, open at almost the first page. "Oh, thanks," Tonino said, rather ashamed. There were 3 opening spells on that page, and none of them had stuck in his head. He chose the easiest, shut his eyes so that he could read the imaginary page more clearly, and sang the spell. Gently and easily, the window swung open, letting in a gust of cold wind. And Benvenuto came in with the wind, almost as lightly. As Benvenuto trod gently up the scale towards him, Tonino had another moment when he knew how mice felt. Then he forgot it in the gladness of seeing Benvenuto. He stretched his arms wide to rub behind Benvenuto's horny ears. Benvenuto put his sticky black nose to Tonino's face, and they both stood delighted, holding down a long, humming discord on the piano. Benvenuto said that Paolo was not quick enough. He could not make him understand where Tonino was. Tonino must send Paolo a message. Could Tonino write this size? "There's a pen on the desk here," Angelica called. And Tonino remembered her saying she could understand cats. Rather anxiously, Benvenuto wanted to know if Tonino minded him talking to a Patrochi. The question astonished Tonino for a moment. He had clean forgotten that he and Angelica were supposed to hate one another. It seemed a waste of time when they were both in such trouble. "Not at all," he said. "Do get off that piano, both of you," said Angelica. "The humming's horrible." Benvenuto obliged, with one great flowing leap. Tonino struggled after him with his elbows hooked over the piano lid, pushing himself along against the black notes. By the time he reached the desk, Benvenuto and Angelica had exchanged formal introductions, and Benvenuto was advising them not to try getting out of the window. The room was 3 floors up. The stonework was crumbling, and even a cat had some trouble keeping his feet. If they would wait, Benvenuto would fetch help. "But the Duchess," said Tonino. "And the Duke," said Angelica. "This is the Duke's study." Benvenuto considered the Duke harmless on his own. He thought they were in the safest place in the palace. They were to stay hidden and write him a note small enough to carry in his mouth. "Wouldn't it be better if we tied it around your neck?" Angelica asked. Benvenuto had never submitted to anything around his neck, and he was not going to start now. Anyway, someone in the palace might see the message. So Tonino put one foot on the report of campaign and succeeded by heaving with both hands in tearing off a corner of it. Angelica passed him the huge pen, which he had to hold in both hands with the end resting on his shoulder. Then she stood on the paper to keep it steady, while Tonino wielded the pen. It was such hard work that he kept the message as short as possible. "In Duke's Palace, Duchess Enchantress, T.M. and A.P. "Tell them about the words to the angel," said Angelica, "just in case." Tonino turned the paper over and wrote, "Words to angel on angel over gate, T and A." Then, exhausted with heaving the pen up and down, he folded the piece of paper with that message inside and the first one outside and trod it flat. Benvenuto opened his mouth. Angelica winced at that pink cavern with its arched, wrinkly roof and its row of white fangs, and let Tonino place the message across Benvenuto's prickly tongue. Benvenuto gave Tonino a loving glare and sprang away. He struck one ringing chord from the piano, around middle C, made the slightest thump on the windowsill, and vanished. Tonino and Angelica were staring after him, and did not notice until it was too late that the Duke had come back. "Funny," said the Duke. "There's a new Punch now, as well as a new Judy." Tonino and Angelica stood stiff as posts, one on each end of the blotter, in agonizingly uncomfortable attitudes. Fortunately, the Duke noticed the open window. "Blessed maids and their fresh air," he grumbled, and went over to shut it. Tonino seized the opportunity to stand on both feet, Angelica to uncrick her neck. Then they both jumped. An unmistakable gunshot cracked out from somewhere below, and another. The Duke bent out of the window and seemed to be watching something. Poor "Pussy," he said. He sounded sad and resigned. "Why couldn't you keep away, Puss? She hates cats. And they make such a din, too, shooting them." Another shot cracked out, and then several more. The Duke stood up, shaking his head sadly. "Ah, well," he said as he shut the window, "I suppose they do eat birds." He came back across the study. Tonino and Angelica could not have moved if they tried. They were both too stricken. The Duke's face folded into shiny wrinkles. He had noticed the corner torn from the report. "I've been eating paper now," he said. His sad, puzzled face turned towards Tonino and Angelica. "I think I do forget things," he said. "I talk to myself. That's a bad sign. But I really don't remember you two at all. At least I remember the new Judy, but," he said to Tonino, "I don't remember you at all. How did you get here?" Tonino was far too upset about Benvenuto to think. After all, the Duke really was speaking to him. "Please, sir," he said, "I'll explain—" "Shut up!" snapped Angelica. "I'll say a spell." "Only, please tell me if they shot my cat," said Tonino. "I think so," said the Duke. "It looked as if they got it." Here he took a deep breath and turned his eyes carefully to the ceiling before he looked at Tonino and Angelica again. Neither of them moved. Angelica was glaring at Tonino, promising him spells unimaginable if he said another word. And Tonino knew he had been an utter idiot anyway. Benvenuto was dead, and there was no point in moving. No point in anything. The Duke, meanwhile, slowly pulled a large handkerchief out of his pocket. A slightly crumpled cigar came out with it and flopped on the desk. The Duke picked it up and put it absent-mindedly between his glistening teeth. And then he had to take it out again to wipe his shiny face. "Both of you spoke," he said, putting the handkerchief away and fetching out a gold lighter. "You know that?" he said, putting the cigar back into his mouth. He gave a furtive look around, clicked the lighter, and lit the cigar. "You are looking," he said, "at a poor, dotty Duke." Smoke rolled out with his words, as much smoke as if the Duke had been a dragon. Angelica sneezed. Tonino thought he was going to sneeze. He drew a deep breath to stop himself, and burst out coughing. "Aha!" cried the Duke. "Got you!" His large, wet hands pounced and seized each of them around the legs. Holding them like that, firmly pinned to the blotter, he sat down in the chair and bent his triumphant, shiny face until it was level with theirs. The cigar, cocked out of one side of his mouth, continued to roll smoke over them. They flailed their arms for balance and coughed and coughed. "Now, what are you?" said the Duke. "Another of her fiendish devices for making me think I'm potty, eh?" "No, we're not," coughed Tonino, and Angelica coughed, "Oh, please, stop that smoke!" The Duke laughed. "The old Chinese cigar torture," he said gleefully, "guaranteed to bring statues to life." But his right hand moved Tonino, stumbling and swaying across the blotter to Angelica, where his left hand gathered him in. His right hand took the cigar out of his mouth and laid it on the edge of his desk. "Now," he said, "let's have a look at you." They scrubbed their streaming eyes and looked fearfully up at his great grinning face. It was impossible to look at all of it at once. Angelica settled for his left eye, Tonino for his right eye. Both eyes bulged at them, round and innocent, like old Nicolaus. "Bless me," said the Duke. "You're the spellmaker's children who were supposed to come to my pantomime. Why didn't you come?" "We never got an invitation, Your Grace," Angelica said. "Did you?" she asked Tonino. "No," Tonino said mournfully. The Duke's face sagged. "So that's why it was. I wrote them myself, too. That's my life in a nutshell. None of the orders I give ever get carried out, and an awful lot of things get done that I never ordered at all." He opened his hand slowly. The big, warm fingers peeled damply off their legs. "You feel funny wriggling about in my hand," he said. "There, if I let you go, will you tell me how you got here?" They told him, with one or two forced pauses when he took a puff at his cigar and set them coughing again. He listened wonderingly. It was not like explaining things to a huge, grown-up Duke. Tonino felt as if he was telling a made-up story to his small cousins. From the way the Duke's eyes popped and the way he kept saying, "Go on," Tonino was sure the Duke was believing it no more than the little Montanas believed the story of Giovanni the giant killer. Yet, when they had finished, the Duke said, "That Punch and Judy show started at 8:30 and went on till 9:15. I know, because there was a clock just over you. They say I declared war at 9 o'clock last night. Did either of you notice me declaring war?" "No," they said. "Though," Angelica added sourly, "I was being beaten to death at the time, and I might not have noticed." "My apologies," said the Duke. "But did either of you hear gunfire?" "No." "But firing started around 11 and went on all night. It's still going on. You can see it but not hear it from the tower over this study, which means another damned spell, I suppose. And I think I'm supposed to sit here and not notice Caprona being blown to pieces around me." He put his chin in his hands and stared at them miserably. "I know I'm a fool," he said, "but just because I love plays and puppet theatres, I'm not an idiot. The question is, how do we get you two out of here without Lucrezia knowing?" Tonino and Angelica were almost too surprised and grateful to speak. But while they were still trying to say thank you, the Duke jumped upright, staring pop-eyed. "She's coming. I've got an instinct. Quick, get in my pockets." He turned around sideways to the desk and held one pocket of his coat stretched against it between two fingers. Angelica hastily lifted the pocket flap and slid down between the two layers of cloth. The Duke stubbed out his cigar on the edge of the desk and popped it in after her. Then he turned around and held the other pocket open for Tonino. As Tonino crouched down in fuzzy darkness, he heard the door open and the voice of the Duchess. "My lord, you've been smoking cigars in here again?" Paolo woke up that morning knowing that he was going to have to look for Tonino himself. If his father and Rinaldo and then Rosa and Marco all refused to try, then there was no use asking anyone else. He sat up and realized that the casa was full of unusual noises. Below in the yard, the gate was open. He could hear the voices of Elizabeth, Aunt Anna, Aunt Maria, and Cousin Claudia, who were bringing the day's bread. "Just look at the angel," he heard his mother say. "Now what did that?" "It's because we've stopped our spells," said Cousin Claudia. Following that came a single note of song from Aunt Anna, cut off short with a squeak. Aunt Maria said angrily, "No spells, Anna! Think of Tonino!" This was intriguing, But what really interested Paolo were the noises behind the voices. Marching feet, orders being shouted, a drum beating, horses' hooves, heavy rumbling, and some cursing. Paolo shot out of bed. It must be the army! "Hundreds of them," he heard Aunt Anna say. "Most of them younger than my Domenico," said Aunt Maria. "Claudia, take this basket while I shut the gate. All going to face 3 armies without a war script between them. I could cry." Paolo shot along the gallery, pulling on his jacket, and hurried down the steps into the cold yellow sunlight. He was too late. The gate was barred and the war noises shut out. The ladies were crossing the yard with their baskets. "Where do you think you're going?" Elizabeth called to him. "No one's going out today. There's going to be fighting. The schools are all closed." They put down their baskets to open the kitchen door. Paolo saw them recoil with cries of dismay. "Good Lord!" said Elizabeth. "Don't anyone tell Gina," said Aunt Maria. At the same moment, someone knocked heavily at the casa gate. "See who that is, Paolo," called Aunt Anna. Paolo went under the archway and undid the flap of the peephole. He was pleased to have this chance to see the army, and pleased that the schools were shut. He had not intended to go to school today, anyway. There was a man in uniform outside who shouted, "Open and receive this in the name of the Duke." Behind him, Paolo caught glimpses of shiny marching boots and more uniforms. He unbarred the gate. Meanwhile, it became plain that Aunt Gina was not to be kept away from the kitchen. Her feet clattered on the stairs. There was a stunned pause. Then the whole casa filled with her voice.
"Oh, my God! Mother of God! Insects!"
It even drowned the noise of the military band that was marching past as Paolo opened the gate. The man outside thrust a sheet of paper at Paolo and darted off to hammer on the next door. Paolo looked at it. He had a mad idea that he had just been handed the words to the angel. After that, he went on, staring, oblivious alike of Aunt Gina, who was now screaming what she was going to do to Lucia, and of the great gun that went rumbling past, pulled by 4 straining horses. "State of Caprona," Paolo read. "Form FR3. Call up of final reservists. The following to report to the Arsenal for immediate duty at 0300 hours, January 14th, 1979. Antonio Montana, Lorenzo Montana, Piero Montana, Riccardo Montana, Arturo Montana, nei noti. Carlo Montana, Luigi Montana, Angelo Montana, Luca Montana, Giovanni Montana, Piero Jacopo Montana, Rinaldo Montana, Domenico Montana, Francesco Montana." That was everyone. Paolo had not realized that even his father was a final reservist. "Shut the gate, Paolo!" shrieked Aunt Maria. Paolo was about to obey when he remembered that he had not yet looked at the angel. He dodged outside and stared up, while half a regiment of infantry marched past behind him. It looked as if, in the night, every pigeon in Caprona had chosen to sit on that one golden carving. It was plastered with bird droppings. They were particularly thick, not unnaturally, on the outstretched arm holding the scroll, and the scroll was a crusty white mass. Paolo shuddered. It seemed like an omen. He did not notice one of the marching soldiers detach himself from the column and come up behind him. "I should close the gate if I were you," said Chrestomanci. Paolo looked up at him and wondered why people looked so different in uniform. He pulled himself together and dragged the two halves of the gate shut. Chrestomanci helped him slot the big iron bars in to lock it. As he did, he said, "I was at the Casa Petrocchi around dawn, so there's no great need for explanations. But I would like to know what's the matter in the kitchen this time." Paolo looked. 8 baskets, piled high with round, tan-coloured loaves, stood outside the kitchen. There were agitated noises from inside it, and a curious, long, droning sound. "I think it's Lucia's spell again," he said. He and Chrestomanci set off across the yard. Before they had gone 3 steps, the aunts burst out of the kitchen and rushed towards him. Antonio and the uncles hurried down from the gallery, and cousins arrived from everywhere else. Aunt Francesca surged out of the saloon. She had spent the night there, and looked as if she had. Chrestomanci was soon in the middle of a crowd, and holding several conversations at once. "You were quite right to call me," he said to Rosa, and to Aunt Francesca, "Old Niccolò is good for years yet, but you should rest." To Elizabeth and Antonio he said, "I know about Tonino." And to Rinaldo, "This is my 4th uniform today. There's heavy fighting in the hills, and I had to get through somehow. What possessed the Duke," he asked the uncles, "to declare war so soon? I could have got help from Rome if he'd waited." None of them knew, and they all told him so at once. "I know," said Chrestomanci. "I know. No war spells. I think our enemy enchanter has made a mistake over Tonino and Angelica. If it does nothing else, it allows me a free hand." Then, as the clamour showed no sign of abating, he said, "By the way, the final reserve has been called up," and nodded to Paolo to give the paper to Antonio. In the sober hush that this produced, Chrestomanci pushed his way to the kitchen and put his head inside. "My goodness me," Paolo heard him murmur. Paolo ducked under all the people crowding around Antonio and looked into the kitchen under Chrestomanci's elbow. He looked into a wall of insects. The place was black with them, and glittering, and crawling, and dense with different humming. Flies of all kinds, mosquitoes, wasps, and midges filled the airspace. Beetles, ants, moths, and 100 other crawling things occupied the floor and shelves and sink. Peering through the buzzing clouds, Paolo was almost sure he saw a swarm of locusts on the cooking stove. It was even worse than he had imagined the Petrocchi kitchen when he was little. Chrestomanci drew a deep breath. Paolo suspected he was trying not to laugh. They both looked around for Lucia, who was standing on one leg among the bread baskets, wondering whether to run away. "I am sure," Chrestomanci said to her, "he was trying not to laugh." He had to start again. "I am sure people have talked to you about misusing spells, but just out of interest, what did you use?" "She used her own words to the angel of Caprona," Aunt Maria said, bursting angrily out of the crowd. "Gina's nearly out of her mind." "All the children did it," Lucia said defiantly. "It wasn't only me." Chrestomanci looked at Paolo, and Paolo nodded. "A considerable tribute to the powers of the younger Montanas," said Chrestomanci. He turned and snapped his fingers into the buzzing, crawling kitchen. Not much happened. The air cleared enough for Paolo to see that it was indeed locusts on the cooker, but that was all. Chrestomanci's eyebrows went up a little. He tried again. This time nothing happened at all. He retreated from the buzzing, looking thoughtful. "With all due respect," he said to Paolo and Lucia, "to the angel of Caprona, It should not be this powerful on its own. I'm afraid this spell will just have to wear itself out. And he said to Aunt Maria, "No wonder the enemy enchanter is so much afraid of the Casa Montana. Does this mean there won't be any breakfast?" "No, no, we'll make it in the dining room," Aunt Maria said, looking very flustered. "Good," said Chrestomanci. "There's something I have to say to everyone when they're all there." And when everyone was gathered around the tables to eat plain rolls and drink black coffee made over the dining-room fire, Chrestomanci stood in front of the fire, holding a coffee cup, and said, "I know few of you believe Tonino is not in the Casa Petrocchi, but I swear to you he is not. And that Angelica Petrocchi is also missing. I think you are quite right to stop making spells until they are found, but I want to say this. Even if I found Tonino and Angelica this minute, all the spells of the Casa Montana and the Casa Petrocchi are not going to save Caprona now. There are 3 armies and the fleet of Pisa closing in on her. The only thing which is going to help you is the true words to the Angel of Caprona. Have you all understood?" They all had. Everyone was silent. Nobody spoke for some time. Then Uncle Lorenzo began grumbling. Moths had got into his reservist uniform. "Someone took the spell out," he complained. "I shan't be fit to be seen." "Does it matter?" asked Ronaldo. His face was very white, and he was not having anything but coffee. "You'll only be seen dead anyway." "But that's just it," said Uncle Lorenzo. "I don't want to be seen dead in it." "Oh, be quiet!" Domenico snapped at him. Uncle Lorenzo was so surprised that he stopped talking. Breakfast finished in gloomy murmurs. Paolo got up and slid behind the bench where Chrestomanci was sitting. "Excuse me, sir. Do you know where Tonino is?" "I wish I did," said Chrestomanci. "This enchanter is good. So far, I have only 2 clues. Last night, when I was coming up through Siena, somebody worked 2 very strange spells somewhere ahead of me." "Tonino?" Paolo said eagerly. Chrestomanci shook his head. "The first one was definitely Angelica. She has what you might call an individual style. But the other one baffled me. Do you think your brother is capable of working anything strong enough to get through an enchanter's spells? Angelica did it through sheer weirdness. Could Tonino, do you think?" "I shouldn't think so," said Paolo. "He doesn't know many spells, but he always gets them right, and they work." "Then it remains a mystery," said Chrestomanci. He sighed. Paolo thought he looked tired. "Thanks," he said, and slipped off, carefully thinking careless thoughts about what he would do now school was closed. He did not want anyone to notice what he meant to do. He slipped through the coach-house, past the crumpled horses and coachman, past the coach, and opened the little door in the wall at the back. He was half through it, when Rosa said doubtfully at the front of the coach-house, "Paolo, are you in there?" "No, I'm not," Paolo thought, and shut the little door after him as gently as he knew how. Then he ran. By this time there were hardly any soldiers in the streets, and hardly anyone else either. Paolo ran past yellow houses, heavily shuttered, in a quiet broken by the uneasy ringing of bells. From time to time he thought he could hear a dull, distant noise, a sort of booming with a clatter in its midst. Wherever the houses opened out and Paolo could see the hills, he saw soldiers. Not as soldiers, but as crawling, twinkling lines winding upwards, and some puffs of smoke. He knew Chrestomanci was right. The fighting was very near. He was the only person about in the Via Cantello. The Casa Petrocchi was as shuttered and barred as the Casa Montana, and their angel was covered with birdlime too. Like the Montanas, They had stopped making spells. Which showed, thought Paolo, that Chrestomanci was right about Angelica, too. He was much encouraged by that, as he hammered on the rough old gate. There was no sound from inside, but after a second or so, a white cat jumped to the top of the gate and crouched in the gap under the archway, looking down with eyes even bluer than Paolo's. Those eyes reminded Paolo that his own eyes were likely to give him away. He did not think he dared disguise them with a spell in case the Patrokis noticed. So he swallowed, told himself that he had to find the one person who was likely to help him look for Tonino, and said to the cat, "Renata, could I speak to Renata?" The white cat stared. Maybe it made some remark. Then it jumped down inside the casa, leaving Paolo with an uncomfortable feeling that it knew who he was. But he waited. Before he had quite decided to go away again, the peephole was unlatched. To his relief, it was Renata's pointed face that looked through the bars at him. "Whoops," she said. "I see why Vittoria fetched me. What a relief you came!" "Come and help find Tonino and Angelica," said Paolo. "Nobody will listen." "Oh," Renata pulled a strip of her red hair into her mouth and bit it. "We're forbidden to go out. Think of an excuse." "Your teacher's ill and scared of the war and wants us to sit with her," said Paolo. "That might do," said Renata. "Come in while I ask." Paolo heard the gate being unbarred. "Her name's Mrs. Grimaldi," Renata whispered, holding the gate open for him. "She lives in the Via Sant'Angelo, and she's ever so ugly, in case they ask. Come in." Considerably to his amazement, Paolo entered the Casa Patrocchi, and was even more amazed not to be particularly frightened. He felt as if he was about to do an exam, keyed up and knowing he was in for it, but that was all. He saw a yard and a gallery so like his own that he could almost have believed he had been magically whisked back home. There were differences, of course. The gallery railings were fancy wrought iron, with iron leopards in them at intervals. The cats that sat sunning themselves on the water butts were mostly ginger or tabby, whereas in the Casa Montana, Benvenuto had left his mark, and the cats were either black or black and white. And there was a gush of smell from the kitchen, frying onions, the like of which Paolo had not smelled since Lucia cast her unlucky spell. "Mother!" shouted Renata. But the first person who appeared was Marco. Marco was galloping down the steps from the gallery with a pair of long, shiny boots in one hand and a crumpled red uniform over his arm. "Mother!" Marco bellowed, in the free and easy way people always bellow for their mothers. "Mother! There's moth in my uniform. Who took the spell out of it?" "Stupid," Renata said to him. "We put every single spell away last night." And she said to Paolo, "That's my brother Marco." Marco turned indignantly to Renata. "But moths take months." And he saw Paolo. It was hard to tell which of them was more dismayed. At that moment, a red-haired, worried-looking lady came across the yard, carrying a little boy. The baby had black hair and the same bulging forehead as Angelica. "I don't know, Marco," she said. "Get Rosa to mend it." "What is it, Renata?" Marco interrupted. "Rosa," he said, looking fixedly at Paolo, "is with her sister. Who's your friend, Renata?" Paolo could not resist. "I'm Paolo Andretti," he said wickedly. Marco rewarded him with a look which dared him to say another word. Renata was relieved, because she now knew what to call Paolo. "Paolo wants me to come and help look after Mrs. Grimaldi. She's ill in bed, Mother." Paolo could see by the way Marco's eyes went first wide and then almost to slits that Marco was extremely alarmed by this and determined to stop Renata. But Paolo could not see how Marco could do anything. He could not give away that he knew who Paolo was without giving away himself and Rosa too. It made him want to laugh. "Oh, poor Mrs. Grimaldi," said Mrs. Petrocchi. "But, Renata, I don't think—" "Doesn't Mrs. Grimaldi realize there's a war on?" Marco said. "Did Paolo tell you she was ill?" "Yes," Paolo said glibly. "My mother's great friends with Mrs. Grimaldi. She's sorry for her because she's so ugly." "And of course she knows about the war," Renata said. "I kept telling you, Marco, how she dives under her desk if she hears a bang. She's scared stiff of guns. And it's all been too much for her, Mother says," Paolo added artistically. Marco tried another tack. "But why does Mrs. Grimaldi want you, Renata? Since when have you been teacher's pet?" Renata, who was obviously as quick as Paolo, said, "Oh, I'm not. She just wants me to amuse her with some spells." At this, Mrs. Petrocchi and Marco both said, "You're not to use spells. Angelica—" "But of course I won't," Renata continued smoothly. "I'll just sing songs. She likes me to sing. And Paolo's going to read to her out of the Bible. Do say we can go, Mother. She's lying in bed all on her own." "Well," said Mrs. Petrocchi. "The streets aren't safe," said Marco. "There was no one about at all," Paolo said, giving Marco a look to make him watch it. Two could play at that. "Mother," said Renata, "you are going to mend Marco's uniform, aren't you?" "Yes, yes, of course," said Mrs. Petrocchi. Renata at once took this as permission to go with Paolo. "Come on, Paolo," she said, and raced under Marco's nose to what was obviously the coach-house. Paolo whizzed after her. Marco, however, was not defeated. Before Renata's hand was on the latch of the big door, an obvious uncle was leaning over the gallery. "Renata, be a good girl and fetch me my tobacco." An obvious aunt shot out of the kitchen. She looked like Aunt Gina with red hair, and she hooted in the same way.
"Renata, have you taken my good knife?"
Two young cousins shot out of another door.
"Renata, you said you'd play dressing up."
And Mrs. Petrocchi, looking anxious and undecided, was holding the baby boy out, saying, "Renata, you'll have to mind Roberto while I'm sewing."
"I can't stop now,"
Renata shouted back.
"Poor Mrs. Grimaldi."
She wrenched open the big door and pushed Paolo inside.
"What's going on?"
she whispered. It was obvious to Paolo what was going on. It was so like the Casa Montana. Marco had broadcast, not an alarm, because he dared not, a sort of general uneasiness about Renata.
"Marco's trying to stop us," he said.
"I know that," Renata said, hurrying him past the sleek Petrocchi coach and, to Paolo's interest, past 4 black cardboard horses as crumpled and muddy as the Casa Montana ones.
"Why is he? How does he know?"
Behind them was a perfect clamour of Petrocchi voices, all wanting Renata.
"He just does," Paolo said. "Be quick."
The small door to the street had a big, stiff key. Renata took it in both hands and struggled to turn it. "Does he know you?" she said sharply. Like an answer, Marco's voice sounded from behind the coach. "Renata!" Then, much more softly, Paolo Montana, come here." The door came open.
"Run if you're coming,"
Paolo said. They shot out into the street, both running hard. Marco came to the door and shouted something, but he did not seem to be following. Nevertheless, Paolo kept on running, which forced Renata to run too. He did not want to talk. He wanted to absorb the shock of Marco. Marco Andretti was really Marco Petrocchi. He must be Guido's eldest son. Rosa Montana and Marco Petrocchi. How did they do it? However did they manage it? He kept wondering. And also, more soberly, how will they ever get away with it? All right, that will do, Renata panted. By this time they had crossed the Corso and were down beside the river, trotting along empty quaysides towards the new bridge. Renata slowed down, and Paolo did too, quite breathless. "Now," she said, "tell me how Marco knew you, or I won't come a step farther." Paolo looked at her warily. He had already discovered that Renata was, as Aunt Gina would say, sharp enough to cut herself, and he did not like the way she was looking at him. "He saw me at the palace, of course," Paolo said. "No, he didn't," said Renata. "He drove the coach. He knows your name, and he knows why you came, doesn't he? How?" "I think he must have been standing behind us on the art gallery steps, and we didn't see him in the fog," said Paolo. Renata's shrewd eyes continued the look Paolo did not like. "Good try," she said. Paolo tried to break off the look by turning and sauntering on along the quays. Renata followed him, saying, "And I was meant to get all embarrassed and not ask any more. You're sharp enough to cut yourself, Mr. Montana. But what a pity. Marco wasn't in the fight. They wanted him for the single combat, that's how I know, and he wasn't there, so Papa had to do it. And I can tell that you don't want me to know how Marco knows you. And I can tell Marco doesn't, or he'd have stopped me going by saying who you were. So—" "You're the one who's going to cut yourself," Paolo said over his shoulder, "by being too clever. I don't know how Marco knew me, but he was being kind, not say—" He stopped. He sniffed. He was level with an alleyway, where a peeling blue house bulged out onto the jetty. Paolo felt the air around that alley with a sense he hardly knew he had, inborn over generations of spell-making. A spell had been set here, a strong spell, not long ago. Renata came up behind. "You're not going to wriggle out—" She stopped too. "Someone made a spell here." "Was it Angelica? Can you tell?" Paolo asked. "Why?" said Renata. Paolo told her what Chrestomanci had said. Her face went red, and she prodded with her toe at a mooring chain in the path. "Individual style," she said. "Him and his jokes. It's not Angelica's fault. She was born that way. And it's not everyone who can get a spell to work by doing everything wrong. I think she's a sort of back-to-front genius, and I told the Duchess of Caprona so when she laughed, too." "But is the spell hers?" asked Paolo. He could hear gunfire from somewhere down the river, mixed with the dull booming from the hills. It was a blunt, bonking clomp, clomp, like a giant chopping wood. His head went up to listen as he said, "I know it's not Tonino. His feel careful." "No," said Renata, and her head was up too. "It's a bit stale, isn't it? And it doesn't feel very nice. The war sounds awfully close. I think we ought to get off the quays." She was probably right. Paolo hesitated. He was sure they were hot on the trail. The stale spell had a slight sick feeling to it, which reminded him of the message in the yard last night. And while he hesitated, the war seemed suddenly right on top of them. It was deafening, brazen, horrible. Paolo thought of someone holding one end of an acre of sheet metal and flapping it, or of gigantic alarm clocks. But that did not do justice to the noise. Nor did it account for some huge metallic screeches. He and Renata ducked and put their hands to their ears, and enormous things whirled above them. They went on, whatever they were, out above the river. Paolo and Renata crouched on the quay, staring at them. They flapped across in a group. There were at least 8 of them, gonging and screeching. Paolo thought first of flying machines, and then of the Montana winged horse. There seemed to be legs dangling beneath the great black bodies, and their metal wings were whirling furiously. Some of them were not flying so well. One lost height, despite madly clanging with its wings, and dropped into the river with a splash that threw water all over the new bridge and spattered Renata and Paolo. Another one lost height and whirled its iron tail for balance. Paolo recognized it as one of the iron griffins from the Piazza Nuova, as it too fell into a spout of water. Renata began to laugh. "Now that is Angelica," she said. "I'd know her spells anywhere." They leaped up and raced for the long flight of stairs up to the Piazza Nuova. The din from the griffins was still drowning all but the nearest gunfire. Renata and Paolo ran up the steps, turning round at every landing to see what was happening to the rest of the griffins. 2 more came down in the river. A further 2 plunged into the gardens of rich villas. But the last 2 were going well. When Paolo next looked, they seemed to be struggling to gain altitude in order to get over the hills beyond the palace. The distant clanging was fast and furious, and the metal wings a blur. Paolo and Renata turned and climbed again. "What is it? A call for help?" panted Paolo. "Must be," gasped Renata. "Angelica's spells. Always. Mad kind of reasonableness." An echoing clang brought them whirling around. Another griffin was down, but they did not see where. Fascinated, they watched the efforts of the last one. It had now reached the marble front of the Duke's palace, and it was not high enough to clear it. The griffin seemed to know. It put out its claws and seemed to be clutching at the zigzag marble battlements. But that did no good. They saw it, a distant black blot, go sliding down the coloured marble facade. They could even hear the grinding, down and down, until it crashed onto the roof of the marble gateway, where it drooped and lay still. Above it, even from here, they could see 2 long lines of scratches all down the front of the palace. "Wow!" said Paolo. He and Renata climbed up into the strangely bare Piazza Nuova. It was now nothing but a big paved platform surrounded by a low wall. At intervals around the wall were the snapped-off stumps of the griffins' pedestals, each with a broken green or crimson plaque lying beside it. In the middle, what had been a tangled griffin fountain was now a jet of water from a broken pipe. "Just look at all these spells she's broken!" exclaimed Renata. "I didn't think she could do anything this strong." Paolo looked across at the scratched palace, rather enviously. There were spells in the marble to stop that kind of thing. Angelica must have broken them all. The odd thing was that he could not feel the spell. The Piazza Nuova ought to have reeked of magic, but it just felt empty. He stared around, puzzled. And there, trotting slowly and wearily along the low wall, was a familiar brown shape with a trailing bush of a tail. "Benvenuto!" he said. For a moment it looked as if Benvenuto was going to walk straight past Paolo, as he so often did, but that must have been because he was tired. He stopped. He glared urgently at Paolo. Then he carefully opened his mouth and spat out a small, folded scrap of paper. After that he lay down and lost interest in the world. Paolo could see his brown sides heaving when he picked up the paper. Renata looked over Paolo's shoulder as Paolo, rather disgustedly because it was wet, unfolded the paper. The writing was definitely Tonino's, though it was far too small, and though Paolo did not know it, not much of Tonino's message had survived. He and Renata read, "Urged to Angel on Angel over—" It was small wonder that Paolo and Renata misunderstood. From the Piazza Nuova, now the griffins were gone, an angel was clearly visible. It stood golden and serene, guarding a Caprona which was already surrounded in the smoke from gunfire, on top of the great dome of the cathedral. "Do you think we can get up there?" said Paolo. Renata's face was white. "We'd better try. But I warn you, I'm no good at heights." They hurried down among the red roofs and golden walls, leaving Benvenuto asleep on the wall. After a while, Benvenuto picked himself up and trotted away, restored. It took more than a few ill-aimed rifles to finish Benvenuto. When Paolo and Renata reached the cobbled square in front of the cathedral, the great bell in the bell tower beside it was tolling. People were gathering into the church to pray for Caprona, and the Archbishop of Caprona himself was standing by the door, blessing everyone who entered. Renata and Paolo joined the line. It seemed the easiest way to get in. They had nearly reached the door when Marco dashed into the square towing Rosa. Rosa saw Renata's hair and pointed. She was too blown to speak. Marco grinned. "Your spell wins," he said. The warm pocket, holding Tonino, swayed and swooped as the Duke stood up. "Of course I smoked a cigar," he said to the Duchess, injured. "Anyone would smoke a cigar if they found they'd declared war without knowing they had, and knew they were bound to be beaten." His voice came rumbling to Tonino's ears, through his body, more than from outside. "I've told you it's bad for your health," said the Duchess. "Where are you going?" "Me? Oh," said the Duke. The pockets swooped, then swooped again as he climbed the steps to the door. "Off to the kitchens. I feel peckish." "You could send for food," said the Duchess, but she did not sound displeased. Tonino knew she had guessed they had been in the study all along and wanted the Duke out of it while she found them. He heard the door shut. The pocket swung rhythmically as the Duke walked. It was not too bad once Tonino was used to it. It was a large pocket. There was almost room in it for Tonino, and the Duke's lighter and his handkerchief, and another cigar, and some string, and some money, and a rosary, and some dice. Tonino made himself comfortable with the handkerchief as a cushion, and wished the Duke would not keep patting at him to see if he was there. "Are you all right in there?" the Duke rumbled at last. "Nobody about. You can stick your heads out. I thought of the kitchens because you didn't seem to have had any breakfast." "You are kind." Angelica's voice came faintly. Tonino worked himself to his feet and put his head out under the flap of the pocket. He still could not see Angelica. The Duke's generous middle was in the way, but he heard her say, "You keep rather a lot of things in your pockets, don't you? Do you happen to know what I've got stuck to my foot?"
Toffee, I suspect," said the Duke. "Please oblige me by eating it."
"Thanks," Angelica said doubtfully. "I say," said Tonino, "why didn't the Duchess know we were in your pockets? She could smell us before." The Duke's loud laugh rumbled through him. The gilded wall Tonino could see began to jolt upward and upward and upward. The Duke was walking downstairs.
"Cigars, lad," the Duke said. "Why do you think I smoke them? She can't smell anything through them, and she hates that. She tried setting a spell on me to make me stop once, but I got so bad-tempered she had to take it off."
"Excuse me, sir," came Angelica's voice from the other side of the Duke.
Won't someone notice if you walk downstairs talking to yourself?" The Duke laughed again. "Not a soul. I talk to myself all the time, and laugh, too, if something amuses me. They all think I'm potty anyway. Now, have you two thought of a way to get out of here? The safest way would be to fetch your families here. Then I could hand you over in secret, and she'd be none the wiser." "Can't you just send for them?" Tonino suggested. "Say you need them to help in the war." "She'd smell a rat," said the Duke. "She says your war charms are all washed up anyway. Think of something that's nothing to do with the war." "Special effects for another pantomime?" Tonino suggested, rather hopelessly. But he could see that even the Duke was not likely to produce a play while Caprona was being invaded. "I know," said Angelica. "I shall cast a spell." "No," said Tonino. "Anything might happen." "That doesn't matter," said Angelica. "My family would know it's me, and they'd come here like a shot." "But you might turn the Duke green," said Tonino. "I really wouldn't mind," the Duke put in mildly. He came to the bottom of the stairs and went with long, charging strides through rooms and corridors of the palace. Angelica and Tonino each held on to an edge of their pockets and shouted arguments around him. "But you could help me," said Angelica, "and your part would go right. Suppose we made it a calling charm to fetch all the rats and mice in Caprona to the palace. If you did the calling, we'd fetch something." "Yes, but what would it be?" said Tonino. "We could make it in honor of Benvenuto," shouted Angelica, hoping to please him. But Tonino thought of Benvenuto lying somewhere on a palace roof and became more obstinate than ever. He shouted that he was not going to do anything so disrespectful. "Are you telling me you can't do a calling spell?" shrieked Angelica. "Even my baby brother—" They were shouting so loudly that the Duke had to tell them to shush twice. The military man hurrying up to the Duke stared slightly. "No need to stare, Major," the Duke said to him. "I said shush, and I meant shush. Your boots squeak. What is it?" "I'm afraid the forces of Caprona are in retreat in the south, Your Grace," said the soldier, "and our coastal batteries have fallen to the Pisan fleet." Both pockets drooped as the Duke's shoulders slumped. "Thank you," he said. "Report to me personally next time you have news." The Major saluted and went, glancing at the Duke once or twice over his shoulder. The Duke sighed. "There goes another one who thinks I'm mad. Didn't you two say you were the only ones who knew where to find the words to the angel?" Tonino and Angelica put their heads out of his pockets again. "Yes," they said. "Then," said the Duke, "will you please agree on a spell? You really must get out and get those words while there's still some of Caprona left." "All right," said Tonino. "Let's call mice." He had not seen it was so urgent. So the Duke stood in a wide window bay and lit the cigar stub from under Angelica with the lighter from under Tonino to cover up the spell. Tonino leaned out of his pocket and sang slowly and carefully the only calling spell he knew. Angelica stood in the other pocket with her arms upraised and spoke quickly, confidently, and quite certainly wrong. Afterwards, she swore it was because she nearly laughed. Another man approached. Tonino thought it was one of the courtiers who had watched the puppet show, but he was never sure, because the Duke flipped his pocket flaps down over their heads and began singing himself. "Merrily his music ringing, see an angel cometh singing," roared the Duke. Even Angelica did not sing so much out of tune. Tonino had the greatest difficulty in keeping up his own song, and it was certainly around then that the spell seemed to go wrong. Tonino had the sudden feeling that his words were pulling a great weight. The Duke broke off his abominable singing to say, "Ah, Pollio, there's nothing like a good song while Caprona burns. Nero did it, and now me." "Yes, Your Grace," the man said feebly. They heard him scuttle away. "And he's sure I'm mad," said the Duke. "Finished?" Just then, Tonino's words came loose with a sort of jerk, and he knew the spell had worked in some way or another. "Yes," he said. But nothing seemed to happen. The Duke said philosophically that it would take a mouse quite a while to run from the Corso to the palace, and strode on to the kitchens. They thought he was mad there, too. Tonino could tell. The Duke asked for 2 bread rolls and 2 pats of butter, and solemnly put one into each pocket. No doubt they thought he was madder still when he remarked to no one, "There's a cigar cutter in my right pocket that spreads butter quite well." "Indeed, Your Grace?" they heard someone say dubiously. Just then, someone rushed in, screaming about the griffins from the Piazza Nuova. They were flying across the river, straight for the palace. There was a general panic. Everyone screamed and yammered and said it was an omen of defeat. Then someone else rushed in, yelling that one griffin had actually reached the palace and was sliding down the marble front. There was more outcry. The next thing, everyone said, the great gold angel from the cathedral would fly away too. Tonino was taking advantage of the confusion to bash a piece off his roll with the Duke's lighter, when the Duke bellowed, "Nonsense!" There was sudden quiet. Tonino dared not move, because everyone was certainly looking at the Duke. "Don't you see?" said the Duke. "It's just an enemy trick. But we in Caprona don't frighten that easily, do we? Here, you, go and fetch the Montanas, and you go and get the Patroches. Tell them it's urgent. Tell as many of them to come as possible. I shall be in the North Gallery." And he went striding off there, while Angelica and Tonino jigged against bread and tried not to tread in the butter. When he got to the gallery, the Duke sat down on a window seat. Angelica and Tonino stood half out of his pockets and managed to eat their bread and butter. The Duke amiably handed the cigar cutter from one to the other, and in between whiles seemed lost in thought, staring at the white puffs of shells bursting on the hills behind Caprona. Angelica was inclined to be smug. "I told you," she said to Tonino, "my spells always work." "Iron griffins," said Tonino, "aren't mice." "No, but I've never done anything as big as that before," said Angelica. "I'm glad it didn't knock the palace down." The Duke said gloomily, "The guns of Pisa are going to do that soon. I can see gunboats on the river, and I'm sure they aren't ours. I wish your families would be quick." But it was half an hour before a polite footman came up to the Duke, causing him to flip his pocket flaps down and scatter buttery crumbs in all directions. "Your Grace, members of the Montana and Patrochi families are awaiting you in the large reception saloon." "Good," said the Duke. He leaped up and ran so fast that Tonino and Angelica had to brace their feet on the seams of his pockets and hang on hard to the edges. They lost their footing several times, even though the Duke tried to help them by holding his pockets as he ran. They felt him clatter to a stop. "Blast!" he said. "This is always happening." "What?" asked Tonino breathlessly. He felt jerked out of shape. "They've told me the wrong room," said the Duke, and set off again on another swaying, jolting run. They felt him dive forward through a doorway. His pockets swung. Then they swung the other way as he slid and stopped. "Lucrezia, this is too bad. Is this why you always tell me the wrong room?" "My lord," came the coldest voice of the Duchess from some way off. "I can't answer for the slackness of the footmen. What is the matter?" "This," said the Duke. "These—" They felt him shaking. "Those were the Montanas and the Patrocis, weren't they? Don't fob me off, Lucrezia. I sent for them. I know." "And what if they were?" said the Duchess, rather nearer. "Do you wish to join them, my lord?" They felt the Duke backing away. "No, no, indeed, my dear. Your will is always my pleasure. I just want to know why. They only came about some griffins." The Duchess's voice moved away again as she answered, "Because, if you must know, Antonio Montana recognized me." But, said the Duke, laughing uneasily, "everyone knows you, my dear. You're the Duchess of Caprona." "I mean, he recognized me for what I am," said the Duchess from the distance. The sound of a door shutting followed. "Look," said the Duke in a shaky whisper. "Just look." While he was saying it, Angelica and Tonino were bracing their feet on the seams of his pockets and pushing their heads out from under the flaps. They saw the same polished room where they had once waited and eaten cakes, the same gilded chairs and angelic ceiling. But this time the polished floor was littered with puppets. Puppets lay all over it, limp, grotesque things, scattered this way and that, as people might lie if they had suddenly fallen. They were in two groups. Otherwise there was no way of telling which puppet was who. There were punchers, Judys, hangmen, sausage-men, policemen, and an odd devil or so, over and over again. From the numbers, it looked as if both families had realized that Tonino and Angelica were behind the mysterious griffins, and had sent nearly every grown-up in the casas. Tonino could not speak. Angelica said, "That hateful woman! Her mind seems to run on puppets." "She sees people that way," the Duke said miserably. "I'm sorry, both of you. She's been too many for us. Terrible female. I can't think why I married her, but I suppose that was a spell, too." "Do you think she suspects you've got us?" Tonino asked. "She must be wondering where we are." Maybe, said the Duke. He marched up and down the room while they leaned out of his pockets and looked down at the crowd of strewn, floppy puppets. "She doesn't care now, of course," he said. "She's done for both families anyway." "Oh, I am a fool!" "It's not your fault," said Angelica. "Oh, but it is," said the Duke. "I never show the slightest resolution. I always take the easiest way—" "What is it?" Darkness descended as he flipped his pocket flaps down. "Your Grace," said the Major, whose boots squeaked, "the Pisan fleet is landing men down beyond the new quays, and our troops to the south are being rolled back into the suburbs." They felt the Duke droop. "Almost done, in fact," he said. "Thanks. No, wait, Major. Could you be a good fellow and go to the stables and order out my coach? The lackeys have all run away, you know. Ask for it at the door in 5 minutes." "But, Your Grace," said the Major. "I intend to go down into the city and speak with the people," said the Duke. "Give them, what's it called, moral support." "A very fine aim, sir," said the Major, with a great deal more warmth. "In 5 minutes, sir." His boots went squeaking swiftly off. "Did you hear that?" said the Duke. "He called me sir. Poor fellow. I told him a set of whoppers, and he couldn't take his eyes off all those puppets, but he called me sir. And he'll get that coach, and he won't tell her." The hangings whipped by as the Duke charged through a doorway into another room. This one had a long table down the middle. "Ah," said the Duke, and charged towards a stack of boxes by the wall. The boxes proved to have wine glasses in them, which the Duke proceeded feverishly to unload onto the table. "I don't understand," Tonino said. "Box," said the Duke. "We can't leave your families behind for her to revenge herself on. I'm going to be resolute for once. I'm going to get in the coach and go and dare her to stop me." So saying, he stormed back to the reception room with the empty box and knelt down to collect the puppets. Angelica was bounced on the floor as his coat swung. "Sorry," said the Duke. "Pick them up gently," said Tonino. "It hurts if you don't." Tenderly and hastily, using both hands for each puppet, the Duke packed the puppets in layers in the cardboard box. In the process, Montana's got very thoroughly mixed with Patrocchi's, but there was no way of preventing that. All three of them were expecting the Duchess to come in any moment. The Duke kept looking nervously around and then muttering to himself, "Resolute." He was still muttering it when he set off awkwardly, carrying the cardboard box in his arms. "Funny to think," he remarked, "that I'm carrying almost every spellmaker in Caprona at the moment." Boots squeaked towards them. "Your coach is waiting, sir," said the voice of the Major. "Resolute," said the Duke. Thank you. I shall think of you in heaven, Major, since I'm sure that's where most of us are going soon. Meanwhile, can you do 2 more things for me?" "Sir?" said the Major, alertly. "First, when you think of the Angel of Caprona, what do you think of?" "The song or the figure, sir?" the Major asked, more wary now than alert. "The figure." "Why—" The Major was becoming sure that the Duke was mad again. I think of the golden angel on the cathedral, Your Grace." "Good man!" the Duke cried out. "So do I. The other thing is, can you take this box and stow it in my coach for me?" Neither Tonino nor Angelica could resist peeping out to see how the Major took this request. Unfortunately, his face was hidden behind the box as the Duke thrust it at him. They felt they had missed a rare sight. "If anyone asks," the Duke said, "it's gifts for the war-weary people." "Yes, Your Grace." The Major sounded amused and indulgent, humouring the Duke in his madness, but they heard his boots squeaking briskly off. "Thank the Lord," said the Duke. "I'm not going to be caught with them. I can feel her coming." Thanks to the Duke's charging run, it was some minutes before the Duchess caught up with them. Tonino, squinting out under the flap, could see the great marble entrance hall when the Duke skidded to a stop. He dropped the flap hastily when he heard the cold voice of the Duchess. She sounded out of breath, but triumphant. "The enemy is by the new bridge, my lord. You'll be killed if you go out now." "But I'll be killed if I stay here, too," said the Duke. He waited for the Duchess to deny this, but she said nothing. They heard the Duke swallow, but his resolution held. "I'm going," he said, a mite squeakily, "to drive down among my people and comfort their remaining hours." "Sentimental fool," said the Duchess. She was not angry. It was what she thought the Duke was. This made the Duke bluster. "I may not be a good ruler," he said, "but this is what a good ruler should do. I shall pat the heads of children and join in the singing of the choir." The Duchess laughed. "And much good may it do you, particularly if you sing," she said. "Very well. You can get killed down there instead of up here. Run along and pat heads." "Thank you, my dear," the Duke said humbly. He surged forward again, thump, 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 down marble steps. They heard the sound of hooves on gravel and felt the Duke shaking. "Let's go, Carlo," he said. "What is it? What are you pointing—" "Oh, yes, so it is a griffin. How remarkable. Drive on, can't you?" He surged upwards. Coach springs creaked and a door clapped shut. The Duke surged down. They heard him say, "Oh, good," as he sat, and the rather too familiar sound of cardboard being hit as he patted the box on the seat beside him. Then the coach started, with a shrilling of wheels on gravel and a battering of hooves. They felt the Duke sigh with relief. It made them bounce. "You can come out now," said the Duke. They climbed cautiously out onto his wide knees. The Duke kindly moved over to the window so that they could see out. And the first thing that met their eyes was an iron griffin, very crumpled and bent, lying in quite a large crater in the palace yard. "You know," said the Duke, "if my palace wasn't going to be broken up anyway by Pisans or Sienese or Florentines, I'd get damages off you two. The other griffin has scraped 2 great ditches all down my facade." He laughed and patted at his glossy face with his handkerchief. He was still very nervous. As the coach rolled out of the yard onto the road, they heard gunfire. Some of it sounded near, a rattle of shots from below by the river. Most of it was far and huge, a long grumble from the hills. The bangs were so close together that the sound was nearly continuous, but every so often, out of the grumble, came a very much nearer clap, clap, clap. It made all 3 of them jump each time. "We are taking a pounding," the Duke said unhappily. The coach slowed down. They could hear the prim voice of the coachman among the other noise. "I fear the new bridge is under fire, Your Grace. Where exactly are we bound?" The Duke pushed down the window. The noise doubled. "The cathedral! Go up river and see if we can cross by the old bridge." He pushed the window shut. "Phew, I don't envy Carlo up there on the box." "Why are we going to the cathedral?" Angelica asked anxiously. "We want to look at the angels on our casas." "No," said the Duke. "She'll have thought of those. That's why I asked the Major. It seems to me that the one place where those words are always safe and always invisible must be on the cathedral, Angel. You think of it at once, but it's up there and far away, so you forget it." "But it's miles up," said Angelica. "It's got a scroll, though," said Tonino, "and the scroll looks to be more unrolled than the ones on our angels." "I'm afraid it's bound to be about the only place she might have forgotten," said the Duke. They rattled along briskly, except for one place where there was a shell crater in the road. Somehow Carlo got them around it. "Good man, Carlo," said the Duke. "About the one good man she hasn't got rid of." The noise diminished a little as the coach went down to the river and the Piazza Marcia. At least, Angelica and Tonino guessed that's where it was. They found they were too small to see any great distance. They could tell they were on the old bridge by the rumble under the wheels and the little shuttered houses on either side. The Duke several times craned around, whistled, and shook his head, but they could not see why. They recognized the cathedral when the coach wheeled towards it across the cobbles, because it was so huge and snowy white. Its great bell was still tolling. A large crowd, mostly of women and children, was slowly moving towards its door. As the coach drew up, it was near enough for Tonino and Angelica to see the Archbishop of Caprona in his spreading robes, standing at the door, sprinkling each person with holy water and murmuring a blessing. "Now there's a brave man," said the Duke. "I wish I could do as well. Look, I'll pop you two out of this door, and then get out of the other one and keep everyone busy while you get up on the dome. Will that do?" He had the door nearest the cathedral open as he spoke. Tonino and Angelica felt lost and helpless. "But what shall we do?" "Climb up there and read out those words," said the Duke. He leaned down, encircled them with his warm, wet hands, and planted them out on the cold cobbles. They stood shivering under the vast hoop of the coach-wheel. "Be sensible," he whispered down to them. "If I ask the Archbishop to put up ladders, she'll guess." That, of course, was quite true. They heard him surge to the other door, and that door crash open. "He always does everything so hugely," Angelica said. "People of Caprona," shouted the Duke, "I've come here to be with you in your hour of sorrow. Believe me, I didn't choose what has happened today." There was a mutter from the crowd, even a scatter of cheering. "He's doing it quite well," said Angelica. "We'd better do our bit," said Tonino. "There's only us left now." Tonino and Angelica pattered over to the vast marble cliff of the cathedral and doubtfully approached a long, sloping buttress. That was the only thing they could see which gave them some chance of climbing up. Once they were close to it, they saw it was not difficult at all. The marble looked smooth, but to people as small as they were, it was rough enough to give a grip to their hands and feet. They went up like monkeys, with the cold air reviving them. The truth was that though they had had an eventful morning, it had also been a restful and stuffy one. They were full of energy, and they weighed no more than a few ounces. They were scarcely panting as they scampered up the long, cold slope of the lowest dome. But there, the rest of the cathedral rose before them, a complicated glacier of white and rose and green marble. They could not see the angel at all. Neither of them knew which way to climb next. They hung on to a golden cross and stared up. And there, brown-black hair and white fur hurtled up to them. Gold eyes glared, and blue eyes gazed. A black nose and a pink nose dabbed at them. "Benvenuto!" shouted Tonino. "Did you—" "Vittoria!" cried Angelica, and threw her arms round the neck of the white cat. But the cats were hasty and very worried. Things tumbled into their heads, muddled, troubled things about Paolo and Renato, Marco and Rosa. "Will Tonino and Angelica please come on and hurry?" They began an upward scamper, which they would never have believed possible. With the cats to guide them, they raced up long lead groins and over rainbow buttresses like dizzy bridges to higher domes. Always the cats implored them to hurry, and always they were there if the footing was difficult. With his hand on Benvenuto's wiry back, Tonino went gaily up marbled glacis and through tiny drain holes hanging over huge drops, and raced up high, curving surfaces, where the green marble ribs of a dome seemed as tall as a wall beside him. Even when they began the long toil up the slope of the great dome itself, neither of them was troubled. Once Angelica stumbled, and saved herself by catching hold of Vittoria's silky tail, and once Benvenuto took Tonino's red nightgown in his teeth and heaved him aside from a deep drain. But up here it was rounded and remote. Tonino felt as if he was on the surface of the moon, in spite of the pale winter sky overhead and the wind singing. The rumble of guns was almost beyond the scope of his small ears. At last they scrambled between fat marble pillars onto the platform at the very top of the dome. And there was the golden angel above them. The angel's tremendous feet rested on a golden pedestal rather higher than Tonino's normal height. There was a design around the pedestal, which Tonino absently took in, of golden leopards entwined with winged horses. But he was looking up beyond, to the angels' flowing robes, the enormous wings outspread to a width of 20 feet or more, the huge hand high above his head, raised in blessing, and the other hand flung out against the sky, further away still, holding the great unrolled scroll. Far above that again shone the angel's vast and tranquil face, unheedingly beaming its blessing over Caprona. "He's enormous," Angelica said. "We'll never get up to that scroll if we tried all day." The cats, however, were nudging and hustling at them to come to a place farther around the platform. Wondering, they trotted around almost under the angel's scroll. And there was Paolo's head above the balustrade, with his hair blown back in a tuft and his face exceedingly pale. He had one arm clutched over the marble railing, the other stretched away downward. Tonino peered between the marble pillars to see why, and there was the miserable, humped huddle of Renata hanging on to Paolo. "But she's terrified of heights," said Angelica. "How did she get this high?" Vittoria told Angelica she was to get Renata up at once. Angelica stuck her upper half out between the pillars. Being small certainly had its advantages. Distances which were mercilessly huge to Renata and Paolo were too far away to worry Angelica. The dome was like a whole small world to her. Paolo said, carefully patient, "I can't hold on much longer. Do you think you can have another try?" The answer from Renata was a sobbing shudder. "Renata!" shouted Angelica. Renata's scared face turned slowly up. "Something's happened to my eyes now. You look tiny." "I am tiny," yelled Angelica. "Both of them are," Paolo said, staring at Tonino's head. "Pull me up, quick," said Renata. The size of Angelica and Tonino so worried Renata and Paolo that both of them forgot they were hundreds of feet in the air. Paolo heaved on Renata, and Renata shoved at Paolo, and they scrambled over the marble rail in a second. But there, Renata looked up at the immense golden angel and had an instant relapse. "Oh, oh," she wailed, and sank down in a heap against the golden pedestal. Tonino and Angelica huddled behind her. The warmth of climbing had worn off. They were feeling the wind keenly through their scanty nightshirts. Benvenuto leaped across Renata to them. Something else had to be done, and done quickly. Tonino went again, and looked through the marble pillars where the dome curved away and down like an ice field with ribs of green and gold. There, coming into view over the curve, was a bright red uniform, making Marco's carroty hair look faded and sallow against it. The uniform went with Marco's hair even less well than the crimson he had worn as a coachman. Tonino knew who Marco was in that instant, but that bothered him less than seeing Marco flattened to the surface and looking backwards, which Tonino was sure was a mistake. Beyond Marco's boots, fair hair was wildly blowing. Rosa's flushed face came into sight. "I'm all right. Look after yourself," Rosa said. Benvenuto was beside Tonino. "They were to come up quicker than that. It was important." "Get Rosa and Marco up here quickly," Tonino shrieked to Paolo. He did not know if he had caught the feeling from the cats or not, but he was sure Rosa and Marco were in danger. Paolo went unwillingly to the railing and flinched at the height. "They've been following us and shouting the whole way," he said. "Get up here, quickly," he shouted. "Thank you very much," Marco shouted back. "Whose fault is it we're up here anyway?" "Is Renata all right?" Rosa yelled. Angelica and Tonino pushed themselves between the pillars. "Hurry up!" they screamed. The sight of them worked on Rosa and Marco as it had done on Renata and Paolo. They stared at the two tiny figures and got to their feet as they stared. Then, stooping over, with their hands hanging, they came racing up the last of the curve for a closer look. Marco tumbled over the rail and said as he was pulling Rosa over, "I couldn't believe my eyes at first. We'd better do a growing spell before—" "Get down!" said Paolo. Benvenuto's message was so urgent that he had caught it too. Both cats were crouching, stiff and low, and even Benvenuto's flat ears were flattened. Rosa stooped down. Marco grudgingly went on one knee. "Look here, Paolo," he began. A savage gale hit the dome. Freezing wind shrieked across the platform, howled in the spaces between the marble pillars, and scoured across the curve of the dome below. The angel's wings thrummed with it. It brought stabs of rain and needles of ice, hurling so hard that Tonino was thrown flat on his face. He could hear ice rattling on the angel and spitting on the dome. Paolo snatched him into shelter behind himself. Renata feebly scrabbled about until she found Angelica and dragged her into shelter by one arm. Marco and Rosa bowed over. It was quite clear that anyone climbing the dome would have been blown off. The wind passed, wailing like a wolf. They raised their heads into the sun. The Duchess was standing on the platform in front of them. She had melting ice winking and trickling from her hair and from every fold of her marble-grey dress. The smile on her waxy face was not pleasant. "Oh, no," she said. "The angel is not going to help anyone this time. Did you think I'd forgotten?" Marco and Rosa looked up at the angel's golden arm holding the great scroll above them. If they had not understood before, they knew now. From their suddenly thoughtful faces, Tonino knew they were finding spells to use on the Duchess. "Don't!" squeaked Angelica. "She's an enchantress!" The Duchess's lips pursed in another unpleasant little smile. "More than that," she said. She pointed up at the angel. "Let the words be removed from the scroll," she said. There was a click from the huge golden statue, followed by a grating sound, as if a spring had been released. The arm holding the scroll began to move, gently and steadily downwards, making the slightest grinding noise as it moved. They could hear it easily, in spite of a sudden clatter of gunfire from the houses beyond the river. Downwards and inwards travelled the angel's arm until it stopped with a small clunk. The scroll now hung flashing in the sun between them and the Duchess. There were large, raised letters on it. Angelus, they saw. Capronensi populo. It was as if the angel were holding it out for them to read. "Exactly," said the Duchess, though Tonino thought, from the surprised arch of her eyebrows, that this was not at all what she expected. She pointed again at the scroll, with a long white finger like a white wax pencil. "Erase," she said, "word by word." Their heads all tipped anxiously as they looked at the lines of writing. The first word read Carmen, and sure enough, the golden capital C was sinking slowly away into the metal background. Paolo moved. He had to do something. The Duchess glanced at him, a contemptuous flick of the eyebrows. Paolo found he was twisted to the spot with jabbing cramp in both legs. But he could still speak, and he remembered what Marco and Rosa had said last night. Without daring to draw breath, he screamed as loud as he could, "Chrestomanci!" There was more wind. This was one keen, blaring gust. And Chrestomanci was there, beyond Renata and the cats. There was so little room on the platform that Chrestomanci rocked and quickly took hold of the marble balustrade. He was still in uniform, but it was muddy, and he looked extremely tired. The Duchess whirled around and pointed her long finger at him.
"You! I misled you!"
"Oh, you did," Chrestomanci said. If the Duchess had hoped to catch him off balance, she was too late. Chrestomanci was steady now. "You led me a proper wild goose chase," he said, and put out one hand, palm forward, towards her pointing finger. The long finger bent and began dripping white, as if it were wax indeed. The Duchess stared at it, and then looked up at Chrestomanci almost imploringly. "No," Chrestomanci said, sounding very tired. "I think you've done enough harm. Take your true form, please." He beckoned at her, like someone sick of waiting. Instantly, the Duchess's body was seething out of shape. Her arms gathered inwards, her face lengthened, and yet still remained the same waxy, sardonic face. Whiskers sprang from her upper lip, and her eyes lit red like bulging lamps. Her marble skirts turned white, billowed, and gathered soapily to her ankles, revealing her feet as long, pink claws. And all the time she was shrinking. 2 teeth appeared at the end of her lengthened white face. A naked pink tail, marked in rings like an earthworm, snaked from behind the soapy bundle of her skirts and lashed the marble floor angrily. She shrank again. Finally, a huge white rat with eyes like red marbles leaped to the marble railings and crouched, chittering and glaring, with its humped back twitching. "The white devil," said Chrestomanci, "which the angel was sent to expel from Caprona. Right, Benvenuto and Vittoria, she's all yours. Make sure she never comes back." Benvenuto and Vittoria were already creeping forward. Their tails swept about and their eyes stared. They sprang. The rat sprang too, off the parapet with a squeal, and went racing away down the dome. Benvenuto raced with it, long and low, keeping just beside the pink whip of its tail. Vittoria raced the other side, a snowy silver making the great rat look yellow, running at the rat's shoulder. They saw the rat turn and try to bite her, and then suddenly the 3 were joined by a dozen smaller rats, all running and squealing. They only saw them for an instant, before the whole group ran over the slope of the dome and disappeared. "Her helpers from the palace," said Chrestomanci.
"Will Vittoria be safe?"
said Angelica. "She's the best ratter in Caprona, isn't she?" said Chrestomanci. "Apart from Benvenuto, that is. And by the time the devil and her friends get to the ground, they'll have every cat in Caprona after them. Now..." Tonino found he was the right size again. He clung to Rosa's hand. Beyond Rosa, he could see Angelica, also the right size, shivering and pulling her flimsy blue dress down over her knees before she grabbed for Marco's hand. The wind was far worse on a larger body, but what made Tonino grab at Rosa was not that. The dome was not world-sized any more. It was a white hummock wheeling in a grey-brown landscape. The hills around Caprona were pitilessly clear. He could see flashes of flame and running figures which seemed to be almost beside him or just above him, as if the tiny white dome had reeled over on its side. Yet the houses of Caprona were immeasurably deep below, and the river seemed to stand up out of them. The new bridge appeared almost overhead, suffused in clouds of smoke. Smoke rolled in the hills and swirled giddily out of the downside-upside houses beyond the old bridge, and worst of all, the boom and clap and rattle and yammer of guns was now nearly deafening. Tonino no longer wondered what had scared Renata and Paolo so. He felt as if he was spinning to his death. He clung to Rosa's hand and looked desperately up at the angel. That, at least, was still huge. The scroll, which it still held patiently towards them, was almost as big as the side of a house. "Now," said Chrestomanci, "the best thing you can do, all of you, is to sing those words, quickly."
"What, me too?"
said Angelica. "Yes, all of you," said Chrestomanci. They gathered, the 6 of them, against the marble parapet, facing the golden scroll, with the new bridge behind them, and began, somewhat uncertainly, to fit those words to the tune of the Angel of Caprona. They matched like a glove. As soon as they realized this, everyone sang lustily. Angelica and Renata stopped shivering. Tonino let go of Rosa's hand, and Rosa put her arm over his shoulders instead. And they sang as if they had always known those words. It was only a version of the usual words in Latin, but it was what the tune had always asked for. Carmen pacis seculare, venit angelus cantare, et Deor sum pacem dare, Capronensi populo. Dabit pacem aeternalem, sine morbo immortalem, sine pugna triumphalem, Capronensi populo. En diabola albata, de Caprona expulsata, misa pax et virtus data, Capronensi populo. When they had finished, there was silence. There was not a sound from the hills, or the new bridge, or the streets below. Every noise had stopped. So they were all the more startled at the tinny slithering with which the angel slowly rolled up the scroll. The shining, outstretched wings bent and settled against the angel's golden shoulders, where the angel gave them a shake to order the feathers. And that noise was not the sound of metal, but the softer rattling of real pinions. It brought with it a scent of such sweetness that there was a moment when they were not aware of anything else. In that moment, the angel was in flight. As the huge golden wings passed over them, the scent came again, and with it the sound of singing. It seemed like hundreds of voices, singing tune, harmony, and descant to the Angel of Caprona. They had no idea if it was the angel alone or something else. They looked up and watched the golden figure wheel and soar and wheel until it was only a golden glint in the sky. And there was still utter silence, except for the singing. Rosa sighed. "I suppose we'd better climb down." Renata began to shiver again at the thought. Chrestomanci sighed too. "Don't worry about that." They were suddenly down again, on solid cobbles in the cathedral forecourt. The cathedral was once more a great white building. The houses were high, the hills were way beyond, and the people surrounding them were anything but quiet. Everyone was running to where they could see the angel, flashing in the sun as he soared. The Archbishop was in tears, and so was the Duke. They were wringing one another's hands beside the Duke's coach. And Chrestomanci had brought them to earth in time to see another miracle. The coach began to work and bounce on its springs. Both doors burst open. Aunt Francesca squeezed out of one, and Guido Petrocchi fell out after her. From the other door tumbled Rinaldo and the red-haired Petrocchi aunt. After them came mingled Montanas and Petrocchis, more and more and more, until anyone could see that the coach could not possibly have held that number. People stopped crowding to see the angel, and crowded to look at the Duke's coach instead. Rosa and Marco looked at one another, and began to back away among the spectators. But Chrestomanci took them each by a shoulder. "It'll be all right," he said. "And if it isn't, I'll set you up in a spell house in Venice." Antonio disentangled himself from a Petrocchi uncle and hurried with Guido towards Tonino and Angelica. "Are you all right?" both of them said. "Was it you who fetched the griffins?" They broke off to stare coldly at one another. "Yes," said Tonino. "I'm sorry you were turned into puppets." "She was too clever for us," said Angelica. "But be thankful that you got your proper clothes back afterwards. Look at us. They were pulled apart, then, by aunts and cousins, fearing they were contaminating one another, and hurriedly given coats and sweaters by uncles. Paolo was swept away from Renata, too, by Aunt Maria. "Don't go near her, my love." "Oh, well," said Renata, as she was pulled away, too. "Thanks for helping me up the dome, anyway." "Just a moment," Chrestomanci said loudly. Everyone turned to him, respectful but irritable. "If each spell house," he said, "insists on regarding the other as monsters, I can promise you that Caprona will shortly fall again." They stared at him, Montanas and Petrocchis equally indignant. The Archbishop looked at the Duke, and both of them began to edge towards the shelter of the cathedral porch. "What are you talking about?" Rinaldo said aggressively. His dignity was damaged by being a puppet anyway. The look in his eyes seemed to promise cowpats for everyone, with the largest share for Chrestomanci. "I'm talking about the Angel of Caprona," said Chrestomanci. "When the angel alighted on the cathedral, in the time of the first Duke of Caprona, bearing the safety of Caprona with him, history clearly states that the Duke appointed 2 men, Antonio Petrocchi and Piero Montana, to be keepers of the words of the angel, and therefore keepers of the safety of Caprona. In memory of this, each casa has an angel over its gate, and the great angel stands on a pedestal showing the Petrocchi leopard entwined with the Montana winged horse." Chrestomanci pointed upwards. "If you don't believe me, ask for ladders and go and see." Antonio Petrocchi and Piero Montana were fast friends, and so were their families after them. There were frequent marriages between the 2 casas, and Caprona became a great city and a strong state. Its decline dates from that ridiculous quarrel between Riccardo and Francesco. There were murmurs from Montanas and Petrocchis alike here that the quarrel was not ridiculous. "Of course it was," said Chrestomanci. "You've all been deceived from your cradles up. You've let Riccardo and Francesco fool you for 2 centuries. What they really quarreled about we shall never know, but I know they both told their families the same lies, and you have all gone on believing their lies and getting deeper and deeper divided until the white devil was actually able to enter Caprona again." Again there were murmurs. Antonio said, "The Duchess was the White Devil, but—" "Yes," said Chrestomanci. "And she has gone for the moment, because the words were found and the angel awakened by members of both families. I suspect it could only have been done by Montanas and Patrokis united. The rest of you could have sung the right words separately until you were all blue in the face, and nothing would have happened. The angel respects only friendship. The young ones of both families are luckily less bigoted than the rest of you. Marco and Rosa have even had the courage to fall in love and get married." Up till then, both families had listened, restively, it was true, because it was not pleasant to be lectured in front of a crowd of fellow citizens, not to speak of the Duke and the Archbishop, but they had listened. But at this, pandemonium broke out.
"Married?"
screamed the Montanas.
"She's a Montana!"
screamed the Patrokis. Insults were yelled at Rosa and at Marco. Anyone who wished to count would have found no less than 10 aunts in tears at once, and all cursing as they wept. Rosa and Marco were both white. It needed only Ronaldo to step up to Marco, glowering. And he did. "This scum," he said to Rosa, "knocked me down and cut my head open, and you marry it." Chrestomanci made haste to get between Marco and Ronaldo. "I'd hoped someone would see reason," he said to Rosa. He seemed very tired. "It had better be Venice." "Get out of my way," said Ronaldo, "you double-dealing sorcerer." "Please move, sir," said Marco. "I don't need to be shielded from an idiot like him." "Marco," said Chrestomanci, "have you thought what 2 families of powerful magicians could do to you and Rosa?" "Of course we have," Marco said angrily, trying to push Chrestomanci aside. But a strange silence fell again. The silence of the angel. The Archbishop knelt down. Awed people crowded to one side or another of the cathedral yard. The angel was returning. He came from far off down the Corso, on foot now, with his wingtips brushing the cobbles and the chorus of voices swelling as he approached. As he passed through the cathedral court, it was seen that in every place where a feather had touched the stones, there grew a cluster of small golden flowers. Scent gushed over everyone as the angel drew near and halted by the cathedral porch, towering and golden. There he turned his remote, smiling face to everyone present. His voice was like one voice, singing above many. "Caprona is at peace. Keep our covenant." At that, he spread his wings, making them all dizzy with the scent. And he was next seen moving upwards, over lesser domes and greater, to take his place once more on the great dome, guarding Caprona in the years to come. This is really the end of the story, except for 1 or 2 explanations. Marco and Rosa had to tell their story many times, at least as often as Tonino and Angelica told theirs. Among the first people they told it to was old Niccolò, who was lying restlessly in bed and only kept there because Elizabeth sat beside him all the time. "But I'm quite well," he kept saying. So in order to keep him there, Elizabeth had first Tonino and then Rosa and Marco come and tell him their stories. Rosa and Marco had met when they were both working on the old bridge. Falling in love and deciding to marry had been the easiest part, over in minutes. The difficulty was that they had to provide themselves with a family each which had nothing to do with either casa. Rosa contrived a family first. She pretended to be English. She became very friendly with the English girl at the art gallery, the same Jane Smith that Ronaldo fancied so much. Jane Smith thought it was a great joke to pretend to be Rosa's sister. She wrote long letters in English to Guido Petrocchi, supposed to be from Rosa's English father, and visited the Casa Petrocchi herself the day Rosa was introduced there. Rosa and Marco planned the introductions carefully. They used the pear tree spell, which they worked together, in both casas, to Jane's amusement. But the Petrocchis, though they liked the pear tree, were not kind to Rosa at first. In fact, some of Marco's aunts were so unpleasant that Marco was quite disgusted with them. That was why Marco was able to tell Antonio so vehemently that he hated the Petrocchis. But the aunts became used to Rosa in time. Renata and Angelica became very fond of her, and the wedding was held just after Christmas. All this time, Marco had been unable to find anyone to act as a family for him. He was in despair. Then, only a few days before the wedding, his father sent him with a message to the house of Mario Andretti, the builder, and Marco discovered that the Andrettis had a blind daughter. When Marco asked, Mario Andretti said he would do anything for anyone who cured his daughter. "Even then we hardly dared hope," said Marco. "We didn't know if we could cure her." "And apart from that," said Rosa, "the only time we dared both go there was the night after the wedding." So the wedding was held in the Casa Petrocchi. Jane Smith helped Rosa make her dress, and was a bridesmaid for her, together with Renata, Angelica, and one of Marco's cousins. Jane thoroughly enjoyed the wedding, and seemed, Rosa said dryly, to find Marco's cousin, Alberto, at least as attractive as Ronaldo, whereas Rosa and Marco could think of almost nothing but little Maria Andretti. They hurried to the Andretti's house as soon as the celebrations were over. "And I've never known anything so difficult," said Rosa. "We were at it all night." Elizabeth was unable to contain herself here. "And I never even knew you were out," she said. "We took great care you didn't," said Rosa. "Anyway, we hadn't done anything like that before, so we had to look up spells in the university. We tried 17, and none of them worked. In the end, we had to make up one of our own. And all the time I was thinking, suppose this doesn't work on the poor child either, and we've played with the Andretti's hopes." "Not to speak of our own," said Marco. Then our spell worked. Maria yelled out that the room was all colours and there were things like trees in it. She thought people looked like trees, and we all jumped about in the dawn, hugging one another. And Andretti was as good as his word, and did his brother act so well here that I told him he ought to be on the stage. "He took me in," old Nicolò said, wonderingly. "But someone was bound to find out in the end," said Elizabeth. "What did you mean to do then?" "Just hoped," said Marco. "We thought perhaps people might get used to it." "In other words, you behaved like a couple of young idiots," said old Nicolò. "What is that terrible stench?" And he leaped up and raced out onto the gallery to investigate, with Elizabeth, Rosa, and Marco racing after him to stop him. The smell, of course, was the kitchen spell again. The insects had vanished, and a smell of drains had taken their place. All day long the kitchen belched out stinks, which grew stronger towards evening. It was particularly unfortunate, because the whole of Caprona was preparing to feast and celebrate. Caprona was truly at peace. The troops from Florence and Pisa and Siena had all returned home, somewhat bewildered and wondering how they had been beaten, and the people of Caprona were dancing in the streets. "And we can't even cook, let alone celebrate," wailed Aunt Gina. Then an invitation arrived from the Casa Petrocchi. Would the Casa Montana be pleased to join in the celebrations at the Casa Petrocchi? It was a trifle stiff, but the Casa Montana did please. What could be more fortunate? Tonino and Paolo suspected that it was Chrestomanci's doing. The only difficulty was to stop old Niccolò getting out of bed and going with the rest of them. Everyone said Elizabeth had done enough. Everyone, even Aunt Francesca, wanted to go. Then, more fortunately still, Uncle Umberto turned up, and old Luigi Petrocchi with him. They said they would sit with old Niccolò, and on him if necessary. They were too old for dancing. So everyone else went to the Casa Petrocchi, and it proved a celebration to remember. The Duke was there, because Angelica had insisted on it. The Duke was so grateful to be invited that he had brought with him as much wine and as many cakes as his coach would hold, and 6 footmen in a second coach to serve it. "The palace is awful," he said. "No one in it but Punch and Judy's. Somehow I don't fancy them like I used to." What with the wine, the cakes, and the good food baked in the Casa Petrocchi kitchen, the evening became very merry. Somebody found a barrel organ, and everyone danced to it in the yard. And if the 6 footmen forgot to serve cakes and danced with the rest, who was to blame them? After all, the Duke was dancing with Aunt Francesca, a truly formidable sight. Tonino sat with Paolo and Renata beside a charcoal brazier, watching the dancing. And while they sat, Benvenuto suddenly emerged from the shadows and sat down by the brazier, where he proceeded to give himself a fierce and thorough wash. They had done a fine, enjoyable job on that white rat, he informed Tonino as he stuck one leg high above his gnarled head and subjected it to punishing tongue work. "She'd not be back again." "But is Vittoria all right?" Renata wanted to know. "Fine," was Benvenuto's answer. "She was resting. She was going to have kittens. They would be particularly good kittens because Benvenuto was the father. Tonino was to make sure to get one for the Casa Montana." Tonino asked Renata for a kitten then and there, and Renata promised to ask Angelica. Whereupon Benvenuto, having worked over both hind legs, wafted himself onto Tonino's knees, where he made himself into a tight brown mat, and slept for an hour. "I wish I could understand him," said Paolo. "He tried to tell me where you were, but all I did was see a picture of the front of the palace." "But that's how he always tells things," said Tonino. He was surprised. Paolo had not known. "You just have to read his pictures." "What's he saying now?" Renata asked Paolo. "Nothing," said Paolo. "Snore, snore." And they all laughed. Some time later, when Benvenuto had woken up and drifted off to try his luck in the kitchen, Tonino wandered into a room nearby, without quite knowing why he did. As soon as he got inside, though, he knew it was no accident. Chrestomanci was there, with Angelica and Guido Petrocchi, and so was Antonio. Antonio was looking so worried that Tonino braced himself for trouble. "We were discussing you, Tonino," said Chrestomanci. "You helped Angelica fetch the griffins, didn't you?" "Yes," said Tonino. He remembered the damage they had done and felt alarmed. "And you helped in the kitchen spell?" asked Chrestomanci. Tonino said yes again. Now he was sure there was trouble. "And when you hanged the Duchess," Chrestomanci said, to Tonino's confusion, "how did you do that?" Tonino wondered how he could be in trouble over that, too, but he answered, "By doing what the puppet show made me do. I couldn't get out of it, so I had to go along with it, you see." "I do," said Chrestomanci, and he turned to Antonio rather triumphantly. "You see? And that was the White Devil. What interests me is that it was someone else's spell each time." Then, before Tonino could be too puzzled, he turned back to him. "Tonino," he said, "it seems to me that you have a new and rather useful talent. You may not be able to work many spells on your own, but you seem to be able to turn other people's magic to your own use. I think if they had let you help on the old bridge, for instance, it would have been mended in half a day. I've been asking your father if he'd let you come back to England with me so that we could find out just what you can do." Tonino looked at his father's worried face. He hardly knew what to think. "Not for good," he said. Antonio smiled. "Only for a few weeks," he said. "If Chrestomanci's right, we'll need you here badly." Tonino smiled too. "Then I don't mind," he said. "But," said Angelica, "it was me who fetched the griffins, really." "What were you really fetching?" asked Guido. Angelica hung her head. "Mice." She looked resigned when her father roared with laughter. "I wanted to talk about you, too," said Chrestomanci. He said to Guido, "Her spells always work, don't they? It occurs to me you might learn from Angelica." Guido scratched his beard. "How to turn things green and get griffins, you mean?" Chrestomanci picked up his glass of wine. "There are risks, of course, to Angelica's methods, but I meant she can show you that a thing need not be done in the same old way in order to work. I think in time she will make you a whole new set of spells. Both houses can learn from her." He raised his wineglass. "Your health, Angelica. Tonino." The Duchess thought she was getting the weakest members of both causes, and it turned out quite the opposite. Antonio and Guido raised their glasses too. "I'll say this," said Guido, "but for you two, we wouldn't be celebrating tonight." Angelica and Tonino looked at each other and made faces. They felt very shy and very, very pleased.
The end. You've been listening to The Magicians of Caprona, the first book in Volume 2 of the Chronicles of Chrestomanci, by Diana Wynne-Jones, narrated by Gerard Doyle. This book is copyrighted 1980 by Diana Wynne-Jones. This recording is copyrighted 2004 by Recorded Books.